Beneath the vast, arid expanse of Nevada, the desert stretches like an unbroken sea of sand, rock, and shadow, hiding secrets that vanish without a trace. Travelers, hikers, and wanderers have disappeared along lonely highways and through windswept basins, leaving behind vehicles, personal belongings, or only faint traces of their presence. Each location, from narrow canyon washes to abandoned mine shafts, bears silent witness to lives cut off from the ordinary world, swallowed by the desolate terrain or lost in the labyrinth of desert ridges. Step into these remote landscapes, where the vanish still linger in memory and mystery, and follow the traces they left behind. Across rugged high plains and isolated valleys, the desert itself becomes a silent narrator, revealing stories of disappearance and the enduring enigma of absence. The M Cave that swallowed a hiker, Kenny Veach. Under the clear Nevada sky, the Sheep Mountains rise in quiet defiance, their jagged ridges breaking through a wasteland of stone and sand. It was here, between the emptiness of the Mojave and the shadowed boundaries of the Nellis Air Force Range, that an experienced hiker named Kenny Veach vanished in 2014. He was a man known not only for his endurance, but for a restless curiosity that drew him deeper into the desert than most would ever go. His story, preserved in fragments of online posts and recovered equipment, unfolds like a riddle carved into the desert itself, unanswered and unending. Before he disappeared, Veach had spent years exploring the barren country northeast of Las Vegas. He spoke of long solo hikes through canyons few had named, of sleeping beneath cold stars where the only sound was wind moving across stone. In 2014, under the username SnakeBitMcGee, he posted a comment online describing an encounter that would later define his legend. During one of his hikes near Nellis, he'd come upon a cave whose entrance, he claimed, seemed to vibrate with an odd humming energy. The sensation was so strong that it made his body tremble, filling him with fear unlike anything he'd known. He fled the area that day but promised to return, driven by the same curiosity that had long carried him into dangerous places. What followed was a chain of events both verifiable and uncertain, documented by the digital breadcrumbs he left behind. A month after his initial post, Veach announced his plan to find the so-called M Cave again. His comment section was filled with encouragement, skepticism, and warnings from strangers who followed his account of the desert's hidden tremors. On November 10, 2014, he parked his car near the Sheep Mountains south of Alamo Road and set out alone. He carried minimal gear, his camera, a phone, and a simple pack, and told his girlfriend he was heading back to locate the cave that had haunted him. That was the last confirmed time anyone saw him alive. The first signs of trouble came days later when Veach failed to return home. His girlfriend notified authorities, and a search was launched across a landscape that offered little more than rock and silence. The Nevada search and rescue teams scoured canyons and dry washes around the Nellis Range border, using helicopters and ground crews to trace possible paths. The official report noted the recovery of his cell phone near a vertical mine shaft, roughly 10 miles from where he'd parked. The mine, deep and unstable, was inspected by rescue teams and by volunteers with specialized equipment. They found nothing else. No footprints leading beyond, no sign of a fall, no body. This discovery introduced the first paradox. If Veach had reached the mine and left his phone there intentionally, where would he have gone next? The site's terrain is brutal, a maze of limestone ridges and steep gullies that stretch towards restricted government land. The proximity to the Nellis Air Force Range fed speculation almost immediately. Some believed he had wandered too close to classified testing zones, where entry is forbidden and patrols maintain a strict perimeter. Others suggested he may have found the cave again and entered it, never to return. But these were theories born of fascination rather than evidence. The desert itself offered none. To those who knew him, Veach was not reckless. Friends described him as methodical, experienced, and physically strong. He had hiked dangerous terrain before, often alone, and filmed much of it for his small YouTube channel, Kenny Veach Adventures. His videos capture the rhythm of his travels, the sound of boots on gravel, the heat of the Nevada sun, the distant shimmer of mirages on the horizon. In one of his last uploads, titled M Cave Hike, he retraced part of the journey that first led him to the mysterious site, describing the exact ridgelines and washes he followed. The footage ends without discovery, but the landscape it reveals is vast and featureless, giving viewers a sense of just how easy it would be to vanish there. The search extended through late November. Local news outlets covered the story, interviewing his girlfriend, who described how he had spoken often about pushing himself to his limits. Some speculated dehydration or a fall. Others mentioned the extreme drop in temperature after sundown. Nighttime in that region of the Mojave can fall below freezing, and the limestone ridges conceal deep fissures capable of swallowing a man whole. Still, rescue teams found nothing. Not a boot print, not a torn strap, not a single trace of where he'd gone. Over time, the digital legend of the M Cave began to eclipse the man himself. Online forums turned his disappearance into a modern desert myth, one layered with questions about government secrecy, electromagnetic anomalies, and hidden military tunnels. The cave's supposed vibration was compared to the low-frequency hums reported near certain geological formations, though no scientific evidence supports that claim. Skeptics pointed out that the desert near Nellis is riddled with caves and shafts that can distort sound, producing odd echoes that might feel physical to those standing near them. But such explanations, though logical, could not erase the allure of what Veitch had described, a cave that seemed to tremble like a living thing. Some of the more technical aspects of his final location have been examined by geologists and experienced hikers, who traced his coordinates using the topography shown in his videos. They identified several possible matches for his route near Blue Point Spring, east of the Sheep Range. The region is marked by sudden drop-offs and narrow washes that twist toward the Desert National Wildlife Refuge, a protected area of over 1 million acres. Within such terrain, human search patterns quickly collapse into uncertainty. The desert can erase footprints in minutes, scatter evidence in wind, and conceal an entire life in plain sight. In the years since his disappearance, Kenny Veitch's story has remained unresolved, preserved in scattered news reports and forum threads that revisit his final hike with almost ritual persistence. Some still believe he's out there somewhere, perhaps injured and never found, while others hold to darker or stranger interpretations. His family eventually accepted that he was gone, though no official closure was ever reached. His camera, retrieved with his phone, contained no final message, only footage from earlier hikes bright with the optimism of discovery. Today, hikers who venture into that same region often speak of the uncanny silence that settles once the wind dies. The mountains there seem to absorb sound, as if the air itself grows heavy. To stand in that landscape is to understand how a man could simply vanish without a trace, swallowed not by conspiracy or myth, but by the indifferent immensity of the desert. Yet the name of the M Cave lingers, passed from one curious traveller to another, its existence unproven but its legend undeniable. Those who study disappearances know that the desert rarely gives back what it takes. Objects survive, but meaning fades with each passing year. In the case of Kenny Veitch, even the few facts that remain seem to point inward, towards something unseen beneath the surface of the world he loved to explore. His story endures because it feels unfinished, a question suspended between truth and imagination. And somewhere beyond the edges of every map he followed, the desert still hums with a sound no one else has ever heard. The Road to Seven Troughs, Nan Dixon. In the spring of 1978, the desert north of Lovelock lay in a silence shaped by time. The old mining routes of Pershing County stretched through low valleys and eroded hills, their surfaces bleached and brittle from years without rain. Wind pushed through empty gulches where miners' cabins once stood, scattering fragments of rusted tin and faded glass. Beyond the dry washes, the road to Seven Troughs passed through the remains of a boomtown that had been abandoned for more than half a century. To travel, it was to move through a landscape where every sound felt borrowed from another era, where distance itself seemed to mislead. Nan Dixon was not a traveller by nature. She was a practical woman, 44 years old, living quietly in Reno, and accustomed to Nevada's isolation. Her family owned property near the Seven Troughs Range, land that had been passed down since the early mining days. She knew the area's reputation for emptiness, its ghost towns, and the way the desert could conceal things. That spring, she planned a routine visit to check on the property, to ensure the old structures still stood against the wind. Friends recalled her confidence about the trip. The road, though rough, was familiar, and she had made the journey before. Nothing about that day, they said, suggested hesitation. The road to Seven Troughs was little more than a memory of the old mining age. Once used by ore haulers and stagecoaches, it cut through a narrow canyon west of the Humboldt Sink before unravelling into a series of dirt tracks. Travellers could pass for miles without sight of another car, and the boundary between road and desert often disappeared under shifting dust. Dixon's vehicle, a light-coloured sedan, was last seen leaving Lovelock around midday. The weather that afternoon was clear and dry, the kind of deceptive stillness that can lull drivers into pushing farther than they should. Past the last ranch fence, the horizon widened into pale gold and white, a place where directions lose meaning. Days later, a ranch hand discovered a car that did not belong among the rocks. It rested deep in a ravine several miles off the main road, its nose buried against the slope, windshield cracked by impact. The license plate confirmed it was Nan Dixon's. Inside, there was no blood, no torn fabric, no sign of struggle. Her purse, identification, and a small overnight bag remained on the passenger seat undisturbed. The driver's door hung open, dust layering the dashboard in fine grain. The car had rolled or skidded down the incline, but not violently enough to cause fatal injury. Footprints, faint and partial, led away from the site and vanished in the sand after only a few yards. The first search team arrived from Lovelock under a flat grey sky. Deputies from the Pershing County Sheriff's Office coordinated with volunteers and local ranchers, covering the ravines and arroyos in expanding circles. Helicopters scanned the region, tracing the dry channels that spilled toward the Humboldt Sink. The search lasted 5 days, stretching into areas where the ground turned to fractured shale. Temperatures dropped at night and rose sharply by morning, erasing scent trails and footprints. Each day ended the same way: wide sweeps, widening silence, and no discovery. The only certainty was that she had left her vehicle on foot. Beyond that, the desert held its story. Search logs from that week mention another detail often overlooked in later retellings. One of the helicopter crews reported seeing an irregular patch of disturbed soil roughly half a mile from the crash site, near an old mining claim identified as the Goddard Shaft. Ground teams later investigated but found only collapsed timbers and windblown debris. Historical mining maps from the Nevada Bureau of Mines show that the area once contained shallow tunnels and exploratory pits dating to the early 1900s, many of which were never properly sealed. Investigators noted that sudden sinkage in the ravine's loose gravel could easily obscure a person from view within hours. The observation was logged but yielded no physical trace of Dixon, becoming another of the desert's unfinished footnotes. The land itself seemed complicit in her vanishing. The Seven Troughs Range, scarred by old mining shafts, offers 1,000 hiding places for the lost. Rock slides occur without warning, and sudden gusts can bury objects in minutes. In that terrain, even the most determined search can collapse into futility. Locals knew the stories. Prospectors who had wandered off course and never returned. Hikers found years later beneath layers of gravel. The desert's cruelty lies not in violence but in indifference. It waits, unmoved by what it takes. Dixon's disappearance was absorbed into that vast indifference, as though the land had drawn a curtain over her final steps. Reports from the Pershing County Sheriff's Office painted a meticulous picture of what little was known. The vehicle's fuel tank was nearly empty, and the odometer suggested she had driven far beyond the usual access point to her family's property. Investigators considered mechanical failure, disorientation, and even deliberate disappearance, though none fit neatly with the evidence. Her relatives dismissed the idea that she would have left voluntarily. She had stable work, close friends, and no apparent troubles. Newspaper archives from that spring mention the search briefly, a single paragraph noting a missing Reno woman presumed lost in desert terrain. After that, her name disappeared from public record. Years slipped by, and the story receded into the landscape like everything left too long in the desert. The ravine where her car was found remained unchanged, visited only by the occasional off-road traveller who stumbled upon it by chance. In the decades since, the area around Seven Troughs has remained largely uninhabited, its network of mining claims reclaimed by sand. A few explorers have tried to retrace her route, guided by old survey maps and the coordinates listed in police files. None has found anything new. The car still appears in some photographs online, weathered and stripped by time, its metal bleached to the same colour as the stones that surround it. Over the years, small theories have surfaced, most of them quietly dismissed. Some wondered if she'd attempted to walk toward the abandoned mining settlement several miles away and collapsed along the way. Others suggested she may have fallen into one of the countless mine shafts scattered across the range, some vertical, some hidden by decades of erosion. There is no shortage of such hazards. Records from the Bureau of Land Management list over 100 open shafts in that region alone. Yet without physical evidence, the theories remain only that, the mine's attempt to give shape to an absence. For those who study disappearances, the Seven Troughs case endures as an example of the desert's power to erase. Everything about the terrain seems designed to confuse distance and perception. The heat distorts the horizon. The stones mirror one another in endless repetition. To search, there is to confront the limits of human memory, the way direction dissolves, the way time folds in on itself. Even modern technology with GPS and satellite imaging cannot fully chart the desert's ability to hide what it has taken. What remains is not the certainty of loss, but the persistence of a question. Along that abandoned stretch, the wind moves through what remains, restless, as though expecting her still. The desert trail that ended in silence. Patrick Carnes. Night, along Interstate 80 in northern Nevada, carries a quiet that belongs entirely to distance. The long asphalt cuts through basins of saltbrush and broken stone, its lines barely visible under the sweep of headlights. In April 2011, a 90-year-old man named Patrick Carnes drove east through this emptiness with his small dog Lucky in the passenger seat. He was returning to Reno after visiting family in Ohio, tracing a route he had followed many times before. Yet somewhere between Wells and Winnemucca, that steady familiarity unraveled, and both he and his companion disappeared into the desert's unlit sprawl. The last verified sighting of Carnes came from a Nevada highway patrol trooper who stopped him near Wells for a routine traffic check. Dashcam footage shows a brief, unremarkable encounter, the elderly man smiling politely, his dog wagging from the passenger seat, and the open road ahead gleaming in his headlights. After the exchange, Carnes drove west, his green Subaru Outback trailing behind the red taillights of a semi-truck. Investigators would later identify the truck as belonging to an independent driver, hauling unknown freight toward Reno. What happened beyond that stretch remains one of the state's most puzzling vanishings. 2 days later, Carnes' car was found abandoned near mile marker 107, roughly 30 miles east of Winnemucca. The vehicle sat neatly on the shoulder, undamaged, the doors locked. Inside were his belongings, clothing, wallet, eyeglasses, even his medications, arranged as if he had only stepped out for a moment. The engine was off, the keys missing. Tyre impressions showed that the car had pulled over deliberately, not skidded or swerved, and there were no signs of struggle or accident. For investigators, it looked less like a roadside emergency and more like an interrupted journey. One paused mid-sentence. At first, authorities assumed Carnes had wandered from his vehicle and become disoriented in the desert's cold. The Humboldt County Sheriff's Office launched a search involving local deputies, volunteers and ground teams equipped with thermal imaging. Overhead, helicopters swept the basins and dry riverbeds for miles. They found only open land, dunes, sagebrush, and faint tracks that dissolved under the wind. Even the dog, whose survival instincts should have drawn attention, left no trace. The effort expanded over the following days, tracing every wash and canyon that cut through the surrounding hills, but the desert gave nothing back. When detectives reviewed surveillance footage from nearby truck stops and rest areas, they discovered one piece of footage that deepened the mystery. A camera near Battle Mountain captured what appeared to be Carnes' Subaru following a large truck late that night. The two vehicles exited the highway together and vanished beyond the frame. The truck's company was never identified, and its driver was never located. Investigators began to suspect that Carnes had pulled over intentionally, possibly meeting the same truck later down the road. Whether that meeting was planned or accidental remains unknown. Carnes was no ordinary traveller lost to chance. Friends described him as disciplined, methodical, a retired Air Force veteran who navigated by routine and rarely deviated from his schedule. He was in excellent health for his age and deeply attached to his dog. The idea that he would simply walk away from his car, leaving Lucky behind, seemed unthinkable. His daughter later told reporters that he'd called her the night before, saying he was following a nice trucker heading toward Reno. He sounded calm, not fearful, and ended the call by promising to be home the next day. That conversation became the last confirmation of his voice. The area where his car was discovered, a sparse corridor between Winnemucca and Golconda, has a history of disappearances and unclaimed wrecks. Old mining trails branch from the highway into forgotten canyons, where signal coverage fades within minutes. In the 1970s, several motorists were found deceased along this same stretch after running out of fuel or becoming stranded in snowstorms. But Carnes's Subaru was full of gas, its tyres intact, its placement deliberate. Investigators began to wonder whether he had followed the truck off the interstate and met with something more deliberate than desert disorientation. A later review by the Nevada Department of Public Safety uncovered an additional clue. Data from highway toll sensors confirmed that Carnes's vehicle passed Wells at 9 p.m, matching the patrol stop. The sensors failed to register him beyond Battle Mountain, suggesting that he had left the interstate before dawn. This narrow gap of roughly 70 miles became the heart of the investigation, a corridor so remote that even experienced search crews described it as featureless. Tracks fade in hours, and wind erases everything that might tell a story. Weeks after the disappearance, volunteers on all-terrain vehicles combed through arroyos south of the interstate, searching for any indication of a campsite, tyre fragments or bones. They found several half-collapsed shelters, simple lean-tos made of canvas and aluminum poles, likely remnants from old prospectors or transients. None showed signs of recent use, yet one shelter contained a torn blanket and a rusted thermos that searchers initially thought might belong to Carnes. Laboratory testing later ruled it out, linking the items to earlier occupants. The find offered only another echo of presence in a place that swallows evidence whole. Despite national attention, leads thinned quickly. Detectives consulted the FBI, hoping to cross-reference Carnes's disappearance with known trucking routes or interstate crimes. Similarities emerged with cases in Utah and Oregon involving elderly drivers who vanished after routine stops, but none matched the exact conditions. Analysts proposed theories ranging from accidental misadventure to foul play involving the unidentified trucker. Others suggested a breakdown in perception that Carnes, perhaps fatigued from the long drive, became disoriented and followed an imagined convoy into the desert's dark. No trace of him or Lucky has ever surfaced. In the years since, the case has drawn occasional re-examinations by independent researchers and cold case analysts. Satellite images of the region reveal how sharply the interstate divides livable terrain from desolation. On one side, the faint lights of rest stops and small ranches mark human movement. On the other, endless plains stretch toward the granite mountains without a single point of shelter. The boundary is more psychological than physical, a line between the known and the vanishing, and Patrick Carnes crossed it at night with no one watching. Occasional reports of unidentified remains found near I-80 have sparked brief resurgences in attention, but DNA testing has dismissed each one. Even the missing person databases list his case as open but inactive, a quiet file among thousands of unresolved names. For those who still drive that route, his story has become a kind of roadside legend, a warning whispered among truckers about the man who followed a convoy into the dark and never returned. The truth, as investigators often admit, is that there is nothing tangible left to follow. Some locals believe the land itself hides its answers. The basins between Winnemucca and Battle Mountain are scored with dry creek beds that appear harmless from above but descend into twisting channels of rock. Heavy storms can move tons of debris overnight, burying whatever lies in their path. A single flash flood could erase every sign of a vehicle, a man, and a dog before morning. Whether that natural silence is what claimed him, or whether the desert simply concealed what others had done, remains unproven. What endures is the feeling of unfinished motion, a journey paused mid-turn, headlights cooling against the wind. The highway kept moving without him, carrying only the silence he left behind. The woman whose car waited in the dust, Juanita Baldwin. The last morning anyone saw 70-year-old Juanita Baldwin was unremarkable in every way. The desert light crept through her Las Vegas home as it always had, pale and steady, brushing across the walls of the small house she shared with a close friend. Nothing seemed out of place. Her purse was by the door, her keys in their usual spot. She had been talking about errands, small tasks, the sort of things that fill the quiet routines of later life. Yet sometime that day she left the house and never came back. When her absence stretched from hours into days, the ordinary calm of her life began to look like the prelude to something inexplicable. There had been no arguments, no signs of distress, no sudden illness or call for help. Friends and neighbours described her as dependable, meticulous, a woman who rarely made impulsive choices. The first real sign that something had gone wrong was not her disappearance itself, but what she left behind, a silence that settled over her home and remained unbroken. The search began the way such searches always do. Phone calls, inquiries, a few local drives along familiar routes. Detectives from the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department followed what little trail there was, tracing her last movements through the dry sprawl on the city's southern edge. Then came the discovery that would shift the tone of the investigation. Her silver 1997 Saturn SL was found abandoned in a desert area southeast of the city, in the direction of El Dorado Valley, a place where asphalt roads give way to cracked earth and windswept rock. The car was intact, locked, and resting off a service track used by utility workers and occasional off-road travellers. Inside, her belongings remained largely untouched. There was no sign of a struggle, no note, no trace of where she might have gone after turning off the road. Forensic technicians processed the vehicle and found nothing to indicate foul play or forced entry. It was as if she'd simply parked, stepped out, and walked into the vast stillness of the valley without a backward glance. Investigators studied the surrounding terrain, a region both starkly beautiful and unforgiving. The El Dorado Valley stretches for miles under an immense open sky, its slopes carved by wind and time. To the north lies the outer edge of Boulder City. To the west, a line of mountains that fade into a shimmering horizon. In that landscape, a single person can vanish quickly, leaving no imprint but footprints soon erased by dust and sun. The search teams that combed the area found no such traces. Reports from those first days described heat rising from the desert floor, the air quivering above the stone and sand as if concealing its own secrets. Deputies from the Clark County Sheriff's Office joined the effort, aided by volunteer search groups with off-road vehicles and small aircraft. They followed dry washes and animal paths, expanding their grid outward from where the Saturn was discovered. Yet not a single item of clothing, personal effect, or physical clue surfaced. The desert offered no answers. Her family members, unable to make sense of the disappearance, released statements that reflected both disbelief and quiet sorrow. They insisted that Juanita had no reason to leave, no history of wandering, and no desire to vanish. She had lived in Nevada for many years, content within the routines of retirement and friendship. Those who knew her best described a practical woman, self-sufficient but cautious, one who respected the dangers of the desert and rarely strayed far from town. In the absence of facts, theories began to multiply. Some suggested she might have suffered a sudden medical emergency, disoriented and unable to find her way back to the car. Others considered the possibility of an accident, a fall or exposure in a ravine hidden by the terrain. But no tracks were leading away from the site. No sign of vultures or scavengers, no remnants of a campfire or attempt at shelter. The landscape remained untouched, as if her presence had been erased. The case files show how investigators circled through the same questions again and again. Why would she drive to that particular area? Did she know someone out there? Was she meeting anyone? Witnesses who travelled the nearby road saw nothing unusual that day. There were no tyre marks suggesting another vehicle had been involved, no recorded calls from her cell phone, and no bank activity after her disappearance. What remained was an empty car under the desert sun and a woman whose final hours could not be traced. Months turned into years, and the investigation settled into the quiet persistence of unsolved cases. Each new search party covered the same expanse, returning with nothing but the sound of wind moving through the gullies. The Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department catalogued the findings, or lack thereof, with procedural precision. Missing person, 70 years of age, vehicle found, no evidence of foul play, still missing. Even as time passed, the details of her disappearance continued to attract quiet fascination among those who studied Nevada's desert mysteries. The case of Juanita Baldwin lacked the sensational edges of other vanishings, but its simplicity made it haunting. There were no sightings, no ransom notes, no trace of departure. Only a car on the edge of nowhere, left like a punctuation mark at the end of an unfinished sentence. Some amateur researchers noted the proximity of her vehicle to old service routes leading toward the Sloan Canyon and El Dorado dry lake regions, areas known for their isolation and unpredictable terrain. Others speculated that she may have followed an old access road by mistake, perhaps looking for a scenic view or a shortcut home. Yet every scenario relied on a single fragile assumption, that she had chosen to go there on her own. Nothing in the record confirms even that. In the years following her disappearance, the desert itself changed subtly around the site. Construction projects crept closer to the valley, power lines extended their reach, and new developments began to trace the edges of what was once an empty horizon. But the place where her car was found remains largely untouched, a small indentation in the dust where searchers once gathered and then left, leaving only faint tyre tracks that faded with the wind. Some investigators privately admitted that Baldwin's case left them unsettled not because of what they found, but because of what they didn't. Everything about it seemed stripped of narrative. No motive, no evidence, no trace of intent. Even the vehicle, so ordinary and intact, appeared more like an object left behind by time than by human choice. The official file remains open. Her name sits among hundreds of others in Nevada's database of long-term missing persons, a quiet record of lives that slipped beyond explanation. There is no closure, no verified theory, no single piece of evidence that can return her to the map. What endures instead is the image of that car, its paint dulled by years of heat and sand, a silent witness to an unanswered question. And in that expanse southeast of Las Vegas, where dust gathers against the stones and heat trembles in the air, the desert keeps its silence. The girl lost in the basin, Chantel Hudson. The file begins with a date, faded on the corner of a yellowed report, 1988. It marks the moment a young life slipped from everyday memory into an enduring mystery. In Leon County, missing person reports in the late 80s were laborious undertakings. Phone calls had to be routed through landlines, radioed dispatches were the fastest form of communication, and deputies relied on printed maps to coordinate searches across hundreds of square miles of desert. The delays and sparse infrastructure meant that precious hours passed before the first organised searches could begin. Yet even these reports, with their faded ink and standardised checklists, carried the weight of an unanswered question. What had happened to Chantel Hudson? Before she disappeared, Chantel Hudson lived an unremarkable life in Dayton, a small town with a population barely exceeding 2,000, clustered along the banks of the Carson River. She worked part-time at the laundromat on Main Street, where the hum of washers and dryers punctuated the slow rhythm of daily life. Her family recalled evenings filled with homework sessions, with her younger brother and quiet dinners at the modest home she shared with her parents. Chantel's social circle was small but steady. She sometimes drove friends along the winding county roads to visit neighbouring ranches or the occasional movie in nearby Carson City. There were no signs she sought danger or adventure, only the restless curiosity that comes with youth and a quiet longing for space beyond the tight boundaries of town. The basin that surrounded Lyon County was an expanse without clear edges, a geography defined by the absence of certainty. The basin stretches for miles of scrub, sagebrush, and scattered boulders, where desert washes twist unpredictably and dry creek beds vanish into sand. Small pockets of vegetation, juniper, rabbitbrush, and hardy grasses cling to the slopes, while rattlesnakes and lizards navigate the cracks in the soil beneath the relentless sun. Historically, the basin had been touched by mining and cattle drives, leaving remnants of abandoned roads, corroded fences, and collapsed wooden structures. In that expanse, a person could easily disappear, blending into a landscape that is as familiar as it is merciless, where distances stretch perceptually and landmarks shift with the sun. Her last verified sighting came on an evening that seemed ordinary until it wasn't. On October 11th, 1988, Chantel borrowed her mother's 1976 Ford Granada, telling her family she was driving towards Silver Springs to meet a friend. That friend later denied any such meeting had been arranged. Around 8:30 p.m, a clerk at a small gas station along Highway 50 remembered her purchasing a bottle of water and consulting a local map, her hair tucked into a simple ponytail and her jacket zipped against a cool breeze. She appeared calm, composed, unaware that the ordinary streets of Dayton would soon give way to the uncertain openness of the basin. That night, she vanished. 2 days later, the car was discovered on a dirt access road at the edge of a dry wash, approximately 8 miles from the main highway. The vehicle was locked, keys inside showing no evidence of struggle or tampering. It sat alone, as if waiting, its presence marking the threshold between normalcy and enigma. When authorities began their search, the desert offered little cooperation. Deputies from Leon County, supplemented by volunteer search teams and dogs trained for tracking human scent, combed the surrounding washes, ridges and abandoned roads. Helicopters scanned the basin, their shadows crawling over the uneven terrain, but the vastness rendered each flight only a small fragment of the whole. Tracks near the car hinted at a possible path, but they disappeared within a half-mile, obliterated by wind and the coarse gravel. The nights dropped below freezing, and the desert claimed footprints and disturbances faster than searchers could follow them. The teams faced the inhospitable combination of unmarked terrain, fading daylight, and the relentless silence of a desert that refused to answer questions. In the weeks that followed, leads emerged and dissolved, each one undone by distance and silence. A local motorist reported seeing a young woman walking along a secondary road near Wabuska, though the description was vague. Another tip mentioned an abandoned campfire near the remnants of a mining claim, but investigators could never confirm its origin. A few townspeople suggested Chantel might have been trying to explore the old ranch roads or had misjudged the time needed to return home. Every lead was checked, every rumour recorded, yet each dissolved into the same persistent nothingness. By early winter, the search was officially suspended, leaving only the desert and its shadows as silent witnesses to her disappearance. Decades later, the records speak louder than the memories, cold notations of a search that went nowhere. Her case file includes measurements, dental records, and a careful inventory of the items left in her car. Handwritten notes line the margins. Area searched twice, nothing found. Family reports she was cautious, no foul play suspected. Old photographs, faded at the edges, show her smiling at the camera in familiar Dayton settings. Online forums dedicated to cold cases occasionally reference her disappearance, sharing the scant details of the car, the last sighting, and the ambiguous wash. Yet in all these mentions, the outcome remains unchanged. She's not been found, and the desert continues to hold its secrets. At present, the basin remains nearly the same, its quiet surface masking the questions that time refused to answer. The dirt tracks once followed by searchers have partially eroded, blending back into the sand. Winds stirred dust into ephemeral trails across the dry washes, and small desert wildlife, lizards, rabbits, occasional coyotes, traverse the empty terrain with oblivious certainty. A few off-roaders and hikers occasionally pass through, noticing the isolation but unaware of the history embedded in the gravel and brush. The air carries a faint dry scent of sage, and when the sun dips behind the surrounding hills, shadows stretch across the land like fingers reaching for a story that remains untold. Her name remains there, caught between paper and the dust of the basin. The vanished researcher of the High Plains, unidentified Lincoln County case. The surveyor had arrived before dawn, instruments packed with meticulous care, unaware the day would not end as planned. He set up theodolites, compasses, and portable altimeters along the base of the Groom Range, a rugged subset of Lincoln County's High Plains. The morning air was dry and brittle, carrying the scent of sagebrush and sun-baked soil. Fieldwork at this elevation required precision. One misaligned measurement could render an entire survey invalid. Yet, as he moved along the rocky outcrops, the flat expanses stretching toward the horizon offered no indication that human plans are ever secure in this region. Records list him only as an unnamed field researcher, a figure traced through notebooks and maps rather than personal details. Government documents identify him by assignment rather than name, a geologist and surveyor contracted to document mineral deposits and soil composition across the High Plains. His colleagues described him as methodical, patient, and accustomed to isolation, traits necessary for work in such remote Nevada terrain. Yet even experience could not account for the way the desert's vastness swallows not only footsteps, but certainty itself. He had travelled alone in similar terrain before, yet each high plain presented its own hazards. both obvious and unseen. Lightning storms could sweep across ridges without warning, sending torrents through dry washes that seemed benign in daylight. Temperatures swung sharply from sun-drenched heat to freezing nights, and the wind carried fine dust that could clog instruments and obscure tracks. Researchers relied on compasses, altimeters, and emergency rations, often leaving markers at intervals to trace their own route. Yet the unpredictability of the terrain meant that even meticulous precautions could be rendered useless in an instant. In this vast isolation, experience offered guidance but no guarantee of safety. Lincoln County's high plains stretched like a quiet ledger, each ridge and plateau noted in geological surveys and satellite grids, yet indifferent to human presence. Winds carve shallow gullies and lift fine sand into drifting arcs, erasing evidence in hours. The ground is a mix of sandstone, gravel and sporadic scrub, punctuated by seasonal washes that swell with rain but remain empty most of the year. Sparse wildlife, a few jackrabbits, lizards and the occasional hawk, intersects with the human trace so minimally that a missing person can vanish entirely without disturbing anything in a detectable way. The landscape is at once familiar to survey maps and impossible to navigate without careful attention. He set out to chart mineral deposits near the Groom Range, leaving behind instruments that would soon become the only evidence of his presence. A portable barometer and a soil sampler rested atop a small boulder as if waiting for him to return. Field notebooks lay open, pages marked with precise coordinates and preliminary readings. At some point, he had paused to take a photograph of a ridge formation. The camera was later recovered from the same area, still loaded with undeveloped film. These items remained undisturbed when searchers arrived, indicating a sudden departure, or an absence that could not be traced through ordinary patterns of the desert. Nearby, a half-finished test pit and scattered soil samples hinted at the methodical work interrupted mid-process. Small flags, bleached by sun and bent by wind, marked coordinates with quiet precision. Hand tools lay beside partially filled soil bags, and a field notebook rested open atop a rock, pages fluttering in the breeze. Even the camera, recovered intact, contained frames that captured the barren landscape in stark clarity, evidence of an intent to document, not to abandon. Every item suggested routine diligence, yet the abruptness of his disappearance rendered the meticulous order meaningless, leaving the desert as the sole witness. Search teams combed the ridges and washes, but every clue dissolved into the flat expanses and windblown valleys. Deputies, contracted rangers, and volunteers organised grid searches, moving slowly across uneven terrain where gullies, scrub, and dry washes created natural blind spots. Helicopters provided aerial coverage, but even the high vantage could not overcome the challenges posed by subtle depressions and the reflective surfaces of loose soil and scattered rock. Dogs trained in scent tracking lost the trail after a few hundred meters, as the fine desert wind carried scents into indistinguishable directions. Each day, hope and visibility eroded in parallel, leaving only the unbroken expanse of sand and stone. Investigators scoured field notes and GPS markers, attempting to reconstruct a route that ended with no witness and no trace. Every measurement in the researcher's notebook was cross-referenced with the terrain, and each coordinate was checked against existing survey maps. They noted distances between survey points, times recorded for each reading, and the sequence of his movements, yet the last entry contained only a single, solitary note. Station 14 complete. Beyond that, there was nothing. Maps drawn in his hand, instruments left in place, and the faint impression of boot soles in coarse soil were all that testified to his presence. Attempts to locate signs of human interference, tire tracks, footprints, or camping evidence yielded no results, leaving authorities to confront the limits of tracking in this austere environment. County dispatch logs and ranger reports record dozens of attempts to trace a path, each one ending in the same emptiness. Teams followed each potential track, noted every subtle depression in the soil, and scoured washes and gullies with dogs and early GPS coordinates. Helicopters and small aircraft circled over the ridges, casting long shadows over gravel flats, yet no new leads emerged. Even the meticulous analysis of aerial photographs provided only static features, ridges, boulders, and scrub, with no discernible movement or human presence. The technological limits of the time, combined with the scale of the high plains, rendered every search exhaustive yet inconclusive, highlighting the desert's relentless impartiality. The notebooks endure in storage, their pages brimming with figures and notes that have outlasted the hands that wrote them. The sheets, yellow with age, the ink faint but legible, provide a detailed account of geology, altitude, and mineral content, yet no narrative of human experience accompanies them. Photographs are catalogued in envelopes, some showing ridges and scrub, some the instruments themselves in meticulous arrangement. Scholars and local historians occasionally request access for studies of regional geology, but the story of the man who measured the land and never returned persists as a quiet anomaly, a human absence embedded in otherwise precise documentation. The high plains remain as they always have, punctuated by cairns and survey markers, yet they reveal nothing of his fate. Wind sweeps across open plateaus, stirring sand into transient patterns that vanish before the eye can fully register them. The ridges, gullies and washes maintain their timeless geometries, mapped but untamed, offering no sign of human passage. Few travellers venture into this area, and even fewer linger. Occasional off-roaders or researchers cross its breadth, unaware of the vanished surveyor whose instruments remain both testament and enigma. The environment persists as if suspended between the precision of measured coordinates and the unknowable vastness of open land. One instrument, half buried in sand, still points in a direction that no one will follow. The rider who never returned from the playa, Black Rock Desert Case. The tyres cut shallow grooves into the white expanse, the horizon stretching like a flat mirror into infinity. The Black Rock Desert unfolded in stark contrast to the jagged peaks that bordered it, a sea of salt crust interspersed with patches of sagebrush and scattered rocks. The rider moved steadily, engine humming, leaving the echo of solitude across a landscape that seemed to reject human presence. Even seasoned travellers noted the surreal quality of the playa, where distances distorted and landmarks became indistinguishable under the relentless sunlight. In this realm, movement was measured not only by speed, but by the careful calibration of attention to an environment both familiar and deceptive. He was an experienced rider, accustomed to desert conditions, navigating the Black Rock on a motorcycle outfitted for long-distance travel. Protective gear shielded him from the abrasive dust and sun, while extra fuel tanks and spare tyres signalled preparation for the isolation ahead. Local enthusiasts later described him as cautious yet determined, someone who understood the subtle shifts in terrain, the way the surface could change within a few hundred metres from solid crust to soft sand. The journey was intended to be straightforward, a traverse between a campsite and the distant edges of the playa, yet the vast openness demanded constant vigilance, each mile a negotiation with both machine and landscape. Sunlight bounced off the crusted salt, blinding and uniform, erasing familiar cues that could guide the unpracticed eye. Mirages shimmered at the horizon, and heat rising from the surface warped perception, creating the illusion of motion where there was none. The flatness of the desert eliminated depth, and the occasional dark streak of exposed mud or gravel became impossible to scale without reference points. Small depressions hid behind optical distortions, capable of jolting tyres and shifting the path of even the most skilled rider. Navigation depended on instinct, on repeated observation, and on instruments that could fail when sand infiltrated moving parts. In such an expanse, preparation was necessary but never sufficient. Beneath the dazzling surface, the playa hides subtle dangers that can undermine even the most skilled traveller. Thin salt crusts occasionally gave way to hidden mud pockets, leaving tyres partially submerged and footfalls abruptly halted. Small sinkholes formed where groundwater had eroded pockets beneath the hardened surface, creating traps invisible until discovered by accident. Historical records note similar incidents, from hikers whose boots sank ankle-deep to vehicles bogged unexpectedly in otherwise solid-looking expanses. For someone moving at speed, even minor anomalies could force sudden stops or swerves, altering a path in ways impossible to reconstruct later. Eyewitnesses later recalled the motorcycle moving steadily toward a distant ridge, then vanishing as if swallowed by the flat light. Campers nearby described the hum of the engine fading into the wind before any sign of danger appeared. No one observed a fall, no one reported a struggle. The rider simply ceased to appear. The disappearance was swift and quiet, leaving only the impression of motion halted mid-stride. In the days that followed, authorities would attempt to reconstruct the trajectory, relying on tyre marks, footprints and scattered tracks, yet the sheer scale of the playa rendered any trace ephemeral. Nature itself conspired to erase evidence faster than human memory could record it. The vehicle was later found upright, ignition still on, parked where the salt met scrub, a silent monument to absence. Dust coated the handlebars, a thin film that had settled over hours or perhaps days. The kickstand dug slightly into the salt, indicating the bike had been left with intentional inertia, yet the rider was gone. Nearby, no footprints extended from the tyres. The surface remained unbroken except for the marks made by the vehicle itself. Items such as gloves and a water bottle were missing, suggesting movement on foot, but the lack of tracks provided no certainty. The playa had preserved the machine while erasing the person, leaving investigators to reconcile the physical evidence with a total lack of human trace. Search parties combed the playa on foot, by ATV, and from low-flying aircraft, yet each sweep returned empty-handed. Rangers divided the desert into grids, following the lines of tyre tracks and interpolating potential paths. Helicopters hovered above, their shadows drifting across the salt flats, cameras scanning for anomalies, but all efforts revealed nothing beyond the uniformity of earth and horizon. Canines lost scent after a few meters, diverted by wind and the peculiar chemical neutrality of the salt. Every methodical attempt highlighted the desert's indifference. The black rock did not conceal, it simply absorbed, leaving no record of passage except what humans chose to leave behind. Surveying instruments and aerial photography were employed, revealing patterns in the salt and scrub, yet no human trace matched them. Investigators used early GPS markers, compass bearings, and photographic overlays to attempt a reconstruction of the rider's route. While aircraft circled to capture subtle depressions or tyre impressions from above, each method provided insight into the terrain's features, but failed to uncover any movement that could be attributed to the missing motorcyclist. The contrast between human effort and the desert's scale underscored the playa's impartiality, leaving every search constrained by the vast uniform landscape and the ephemeral nature of tracks on its surface. Authorities examined maps, radio logs, and the rider's known routes, finding only the disorienting geometry of the desert to complicate the reconstruction. Topographic features noted in prior surveys were misleading. Even minor ridges cast optical illusions, altering perceived distances. Meteorological records showed light gusts on the day of disappearance, enough to shift surface dust and partially obscure any footprints or disturbances. Investigators catalogued every angle, measured every shadow, and cross-referenced anecdotal sightings. Yet all analyses returned the same conclusion. The rider had vanished from a place that offered no witness, and the environment itself did not explain. Local lore and previous incidents lent context to the vanishing, though none offered clarity. Black Rock Desert was known for sudden whiteouts, hidden mud traps, and stretches of brittle crust that could crack under weight. Seasoned desert travelers told stories of hikers and explorers becoming disoriented, sometimes returning hours later with nothing more than an anecdote. Such accounts, while anecdotal, underscored the isolation and unpredictability of the area. Investigators recorded these stories not as evidence, but as atmospheric texture, a reminder that disappearance in the playa could be instantaneous, inexplicable, and total. Smooth, shifting, and unyielding, the Black Rock Desert remains both destination and enigma, hiding all evidence of human presence. Occasional vehicles leave fleeting marks that vanish within days. The seasonal rain and shifting crust create an ever-changing canvas. Photographers and adventurers visit, drawn by the surreal whiteness and reflections, yet most remain unaware of the rider who crossed this expanse and never returned. The desert keeps its record silently, allowing only speculation and occasionally revealing artifacts. A weathered flag, a disturbed patch of crust, that hint at what passed but never confirm who or why. The tracks end abruptly, leaving only questions etched into the salt. The hiker of the hidden wash, Valley of Fire State Park case. The sandstone walls closed around the trail, narrowing with each step until the wash became a corridor of shifting light and shadow. Sunlight bounced off ochre and crimson striations, carving ephemeral patterns into the rock that shifted as the hiker moved. The canyon twisted unpredictably, transforming distant formations into deceptive echoes of what had already passed. Gravel crunched beneath boots, while the occasional wind stirred dust into the air, erasing subtle impressions almost as quickly as they were made. Small desert rodents and lizards skittered across the stone, their tracks immediately flattened by wind, emphasizing the fragile permanence of any human mark. He had hiked the park before, carrying the standard kit of backpack, water and topo maps, yet this canyon was known for its deceptive twists and hidden challenges. Rangers regularly advised visitors to carry at least 2 litres of water per hour of exposure, extra snacks, a whistle, and a compass, warning that narrow washes could easily disorient even experienced hikers. On this day, the hiker moved deliberately, noting each junction and the subtle changes in rock coloration that marked trail progression. He paused at small alcoves to observe petroglyphs etched into the sandstone by ancestral Puebloans, a reminder that the canyon had witnessed passage for centuries, yet offered no guidance for modern travellers once they lost their bearings. Pools of rainwater, etched into hollows of stone, reflected the sun in brief glimmers, masking slick surfaces that could topple an unwary foot. Seasonal runoff carved shallow channels across the canyon floor, exposing brittle rock that could crumble under weight. Erosion had hollowed small caves and overhangs along the wash, providing natural cover for wildlife but also sudden shadows that could obscure footing. Desert vegetation, creosote bushes, brittle sage, and the occasional twisted juniper clung to fissures in the sandstone, their roots breaking through in irregular patterns. Even the most prepared hiker had to negotiate these microhazards, where one misstep could shift a route irrevocably. Sunlight revealed subtle variations in the sandstone surface, including fissures and hollows carved over millennia by wind and water. These fissures sometimes formed hidden crevices large enough to trap a boot or snag equipment, creating obstacles invisible until a hiker was directly above them. Geologists note that the Valley of Fire's Aztec sandstone is porous and prone to small collapses along narrow washes, which could alter a trail in moments. Seasonal runoff often deposits fine silt in these depressions, masking their depth and leaving the canyon floor deceptively even. Such conditions meant that even cautious movement could inadvertently displace a hiker or their gear without leaving obvious signs for search teams. The last visitor to see him recalled a figure moving deliberately through the narrow passage, yet moments later, he was gone. A fellow hiker paused to photograph a rock formation and turned in time to glimpse him rounding a bend, his figure swallowed by the interplay of sun and shadow. No call echoed back, no movement betrayed his presence. Concerned, the companion retraced the trail, scanning the walls and floor, calling his name, but only the whisper of the wind answered. In that moment, the canyon transformed into a corridor of absence, where visibility and sound were deceiving allies rather than guides. Nearby, a discarded water bottle lay half buried under gravel, the strap of a backpack snagged on a jagged rock. These items, recovered later by search teams, provided tangible but incomplete clues. The bottle contained trace amounts of water, and the backpack strap bore abrasion marks consistent with hurried movement, yet no footprints extended beyond this point. The composition of the canyon floor, mixed sand, gravel, and loose shale, allowed tracks to vanish almost immediately under the slightest wind. Investigators noted that such features, typical of washes in Valley of Fire State Park, could erase evidence within hours, leaving only fragments for interpretation. Subtle geological hazards lie beneath the wash, invisible but potent enough to disorient hikers. Thin layers of sediment covered deeper pockets of softer rock and hidden hollows, while seasonal flash floods carved ephemeral gullies that altered the path. Small ledges and uneven surfaces could trip a traveller, sending equipment sliding or forcing abrupt directional changes. Historical records from park rangers documented similar occurrences, hikers encountering sudden sand pockets or hidden depressions that left no trace beyond disturbed dust or scattered pebbles. The terrain, while navigable in daylight, demanded constant attention and respect. Rangers also examined historical patterns of flash floods, noting how sudden water surges could erase tracks within hours. The canyon experiences seasonal flash floods that rush through narrow corridors, moving boulders, sand and debris with force. Past ranger reports documented incidents where hikers' footprints vanished overnight, replaced by mud and sediment in new formations. Search teams factored in this rapid alteration of terrain, yet no flood or water damage appeared near the last confirmed location, deepening the mystery. The canyon's capacity to simultaneously conceal and reshape the environment highlighted how even detailed planning and immediate response could fail to uncover the missing hiker's path. Rangers scoured the wash for days, noting every indentation and trace of passage, yet the canyon yielded only signs of natural movement. Teams conducted grid searches, coordinated aerial sweeps, and followed every potential deviation, marking reference points with flagging tape. Canine units attempted scent tracking but lost the trail within a few hundred meters. The dry, mineral-rich soil combined with wind quickly neutralized human scent. Helicopters documented the canyon floor, but the high walls cast shadows that warped depth perception and masked even the largest disruptions. Every systematic effort reinforced the canyon's indifference to human presence. Surveying instruments and archival photography were employed to reconstruct potential routes through the wash, yet no evidence matched the hiker's path. GPS markers from prior hikes, historical topographic maps, and digital overlays of aerial images failed to indicate movement beyond the last confirmed sighting. Rangers consulted logs of past visitors and interviewed those familiar with the area, noting a small but persistent pattern of hikers vanishing from narrow corridors without warning. Seasonal factors, including heat, shifting sand, and occasional flash flood debris, were consistently cited as complicating elements, though none provided a definitive explanation for an experienced traveller's disappearance. Archival notes revealed similar cases in the park, hikers entering narrow washes for exercise or photography, only to vanish without a trace. In several documented incidents, only personal items, water bottles, small backpacks or clothing, remained after exhaustive searches. Rangers emphasized that even short excursions could be dangerous in narrow canyons, where shifting terrain and deceptive sightlines masked hazards. Such records provided context for the investigation, demonstrating that the environment itself could rapidly erase human presence and confound even the most methodical search efforts. The wash today remains unchanged, its sun-baked walls and shifting sands concealing what occurred decades earlier. Seasonal storms reshape the canyon floor, covering previous impressions and maintaining a landscape of uniformity. Visitors pass through, noting the striated rock and occasional alcove, unaware of the disappearance that unfolded there. The canyon preserves its history silently, offering only subtle hints: a disturbed patch of gravel, a faint indentation, or a forgotten bottle, while maintaining the illusion of untouched terrain. Every observation reinforces the wash's dual nature: breathtaking beauty and merciless concealment. The canyon keeps its secrets, whispering only to the wind that moves through its stones. The couple who faded into the flats. White Pine County Desert Case. White Pine County stretches into an unbroken expanse of salt flats, arid hills, and empty horizons where even the slightest movement seems monumental. Travelers crossing the region quickly realize how the desert's vastness can render human presence almost inconsequential. Roadways cut across shimmering flats, but off-road terrain shifts with wind and rain, leaving little for searchers to follow. It is a landscape where orientation is fragile, where visibility can deceive, and where the ordinary act of travel can quickly become perilous. In this inhospitable space, a couple ventured with intentions that would soon be swallowed by the terrain. The couple had embarked on a short excursion to a weathered homestead, unaware that the remoteness of the area could render every step untraceable. Local accounts described them as meticulous travellers, carrying provisions and water, familiar with the area's patterns of wind and sun. They intended only to visit the abandoned dwelling, a relic of early settlement, and return before dusk. Yet the desert's vastness allows moments to stretch into uncertainty, and even the most careful plans can unravel without warning. Their journey, outwardly mundane, would end without a trace. The sun beat down and the wind shifted constantly over the land, which concealed dips, hidden washouts, and soft expanses capable of swallowing footprints. The flats, composed of clay and sand, harden under the sun's heat but can turn treacherously soft after brief rains or morning frost. Small gullies and ephemeral streambeds intersect the area, often invisible until traversed. Even experienced locals recognize that a single misstep can disrupt navigation and leave a path impossible to retrace. In such a mutable landscape, every movement becomes a negotiation with the environment itself. Their vehicle's path could be followed for only a brief distance before it disappeared into the pale, shimmering expanse, leaving the land undisturbed. Tyre impressions appeared along a slight rise near the homestead but ended abruptly across the salt flats, as if the vehicle had been lifted off the ground. No debris, no drag marks, no footprints accompanied the sudden end. Observers noted the abrupt termination of the tracks with a mixture of puzzlement and unease, aware that the open desert allows no concealment yet offers every opportunity for disappearance. Volunteers and authorities scoured the surrounding flats using both vehicles and aerial observation, yet the desert's constant motion erased their markers almost immediately. Drones and helicopters mapped the area, while ground teams followed faint impressions across brittle soil and coarse gravel. Strong gusts swept away the smallest traces. Footprints, displaced soil, and even the lightest impressions left by tyres, leaving investigators with an empty canvas where human presence had briefly existed. Efforts extended for days, but the desert's relentless alteration of its own surface rendered progress almost symbolic. This region has long held a reputation for silent vanishings, where travellers, prospectors, and wanderers occasionally become part of the landscape itself. Historical records note several disappearances along the northern reaches of White Pine County, often involving pairs or individuals venturing into flats or dry lake beds. Each incident shares common threads: remoteness, sudden vanishing, and environmental conditions that erase almost all evidence. The couple's disappearance fit this pattern, reinforcing a quiet, enduring sense that the land itself can consume human presence without resistance or explanation. A shifting wind can carry away any sign of human passage, turning footprints and disturbed soil into patterns indistinguishable from the natural surface. Investigators observed that even partial imprints, faint tyre treads or scuffed vegetation, would vanish overnight under persistent gusts. The flat's reflective surfaces amplify the illusion of continuity, making it difficult to distinguish tracks or anomalies from natural patterns. Environmental conditions not only hindered search efforts, but also created a psychological effect, where the sheer emptiness of the surroundings magnified the mystery of what had occurred. Even meticulous preparations could not contend with the desert's unrelenting ability to consume presence, leaving only unanswered questions in its wake. The couple's careful planning, familiarity with the area, and knowledge of survival essentials did little to offset the unpredictable nature of the terrain. When teams examined the homestead and surrounding flats, they found no further clues, no discarded personal effects, no disturbances indicating direction, and no evidence of struggle. The desert retained its silence, offering nothing to suggest where the two had gone or how the environment had interacted with them. The scale of the flats amplifies every element of the unknown. Sun-scorched horizons, endless salt surfaces, and occasional rises create a shifting visual plane that can obscure distance and depth. For travellers, the expanse can distort perception, making distances seem shorter or longer and pathways more straightforward than they truly are. Such optical and environmental illusions, combined with the desert's natural hazards, create conditions in which even short excursions can lead to disorientation. For this couple, a routine visit transformed into an irreversible passage into uncertainty. Environmental factors played a subtle but critical role in the erasure of evidence. Windborne dust and sand swept across the flats multiple times a day, while nocturnal temperature swings caused frost and soil contraction, further masking disturbances. Vegetation, sparse and brittle, offered little to mark movement, and shallow washes diverted any flow of runoff that might have carried traces. In combination, these forces acted almost like a natural cloak, removing human interaction from the landscape and leaving the desert as pristine and unaltered as if no one had ever entered. Reconstruction, no matter how careful, could propose only possibilities, not definitive answers. Analysts traced tyre tracks, mapped wind patterns, and evaluated the terrain's features to approximate potential routes. While models offered plausible paths, the land itself refused confirmation. Without tangible evidence, each hypothesis remained speculative. The desert's silence persisted, holding its secrets with an impenetrable consistency that left observers with nothing beyond the initial tracks and the imagination of what might have occurred. The homestead, a weathered collection of timber and stone, bore no witness beyond the marks of its own age. Its walls had endured decades of sun, wind, and neglect, yet they offered no clue regarding the couple's presence or absence. Windows stared blankly onto the flats, and the doorway framed only emptiness. Even this anchor of human habitation, once a marker of routine and settlement, could not anchor the story. The land beyond had claimed what occurred outside, leaving the building as silent and indifferent as the rest of the desert. The final reflection rests in the desert's capacity to render movement invisible, to erase presence, and to create a void where human activity once existed. The couple's disappearance is not only a matter of missing persons, but also a demonstration of how the natural world can overwhelm even the most deliberate and cautious human actions. In White Pine County, the desert remains impartial, vast and unyielding, reminding observers that the ordinary can dissolve into the extraordinary without explanation. The flats stretched onward, pale and endless, and within their quiet expanse 2 travellers vanished, as if the land had quietly folded them into its immensity. The cul-de-sac Walk to Nowhere, Stephen Koecher. Not all vanishings in Nevada occurred beneath the sun-scorched dunes. Some began in quiet cul-de-sacs, where lawns were trimmed and streetlights flickered in familiar patterns. Henderson, a city on the southeastern edge of Las Vegas, was a landscape of suburban routine. Streets arranged in neat grids, driveways lined with parked cars, and neighbours whose lives rarely intersected beyond polite nods. Yet in 2009, this ordinary setting became the stage for one of the most confounding disappearances the area had seen. The juxtaposition of suburban calm against a vanishing that would remain unresolved added an unsettling dimension to the pattern of disappearances near the desert fringe. Stephen Koecher lived a life measured by routines. A young man with a steady job, a small circle of friends, and habits that rarely strayed from predictability. He had moved to Henderson to pursue employment in construction and office management, and those who knew him described him as meticulous, punctual, and careful. Unlike travellers in remote deserts, Koecher's life was structured and seemingly anchored in place, making his sudden disappearance all the more jarring. Family members recall that he had no known plans to leave town, and his daily habits rarely took him far from the neighbourhoods he navigated. On the evening he disappeared, Koecher parked his car at the end of a cul-de-sac, its white surface reflecting the pale streetlight, and walked into a neighbourhood that would soon feel unfamiliar. Records show that his vehicle, a white SUV, was later found locked and undisturbed, with his keys, wallet, and personal effects inside. Investigators noted that the location provided no obvious motive for vanishing. There were no signs of struggle, no forced entry, and nothing stolen. The streets around the cul-de-sac were quiet that night, with the occasional sound of distant traffic or the hum of air conditioners punctuating the stillness. Neighbours noticed the absence first. Reports were made to law enforcement within hours, triggering an initial search that combed streets, alleys, and open lots with methodical care. Officers canvassed homes for surveillance footage, spoke to anyone who might have seen him, and mapped his known routines. Yet despite this organised effort, they encountered the limits of suburban observation. Blind spots between homes, darkened porches, and streets that curved into unknown cul-de-sacs offered countless potential paths where someone could disappear unseen. Each search produced fragments, shadows glimpsed in passing, an open gate or a misplaced shoe, but nothing definitive. Authorities pored over security camera footage, yet many cameras faced away from the cul-de-sac or suffered blind spots, leaving gaps that could not be reconciled. The limited angles captured fleeting movements, occasional neighbours walking dogs or returning from errands, but Koecher was never clearly visible beyond the initial departure from his vehicle. Digital records, including phone pings and online activity, provided no clues about his destination. Investigators explored every angle, reviewing financial transactions, phone records, and personal correspondence, yet the man seemed to vanish into thin air, leaving only a locked SUV as testimony to his existence that night. Though Koecher's disappearance occurred on the fringes of suburban life, investigators considered the possibility of links to nearby desert and desert-adjacent cases, where sudden vanishings had become a troubling pattern. Henderson lies near stretches of Nevada where Interstate 15 gives way to remote desert expanses, and while Koecher was never documented leaving the neighbourhood, analysts noted that the proximity of unmonitored roads and desert corridors complicated the case. Historical comparisons drew attention to travellers disappearing from familiar areas, highlighting that geography alone did not dictate vulnerability. The pattern was unsettling, people disappearing from ordinary routines, often leaving behind possessions and no signs of struggle. Months of interviews, cross-checking of alibis and public appeals produced little clarity. The streets remained undisturbed, and his route beyond the cul-de-sac remained speculative. Volunteers from neighbourhood watch groups joined searches, often tracing sidewalks, drainage channels and small parks, yet the suburban environment, once assumed to be secure, revealed countless blind spots. Authorities speculated that if Kocher had moved toward open land, irrigation ditches or neighbouring developments, even short distances could make detection difficult. Each theory seemed plausible, yet none yielded proof. The absence of evidence was absolute enough to deepen the mystery, but fragmentary enough to sustain hope and speculation simultaneously. Investigators also examined the physical layout of the cul-de-sac and surrounding streets, noting details that might explain the disappearance. Certain paths led to gated backyards, maintenance areas, or small drainage corridors that connected indirectly to desert-adjacent roads. Fence heights, locked gates, and narrow service paths created a labyrinthine network that, while familiar to locals, could conceal movements from casual observation. Parked vehicles, hedges, and utility boxes further obscured sightlines, emphasizing how even a brief walk could leave no visible trace. Analysts concluded that environmental features, mundane to residents, had the unintended capacity to erase a person from immediate notice. The broader layout of Henderson revealed unmonitored service roads and utility corridors that granted access to the city's outskirts. These narrow pathways, often used for maintenance vehicles, offered potential exit routes that a pedestrian could traverse without attracting attention. Satellite imagery and city planning maps revealed a network of lightly patrolled alleys and drainage channels, connecting residential streets to desert-adjacent areas. Analysts considered whether Kocher, intentionally or otherwise, might have wandered into one of these service corridors, which could have allowed him to reach open land without ever crossing a main road. The subtle interplay between suburban planning and natural terrain underscored the challenges investigators faced in accounting for every possible route, highlighting how ordinary city layouts could complicate even the most meticulous search. Records indicate that Kocher's personal history provided no insight into an intentional disappearance. He maintained employment records, financial accounts, and social contacts in order, showing no sign of premeditated flight. Family and friends confirmed his routines, hobbies, and interests, emphasizing the absence of unusual stressors or conflicts. Investigators considered the possibility of an accident, misadventure, or intervention by a third party, but suburban disappearances rarely left physical evidence, particularly when occurring in areas with numerous sightline obstructions and minor pathways. The neighborhood's ordinary appearance concealed the extraordinary uncertainty beneath. Long-term investigative efforts included periodic neighborhood sweeps, renewed public appeals, and media coverage that attempted to generate tips. Over the years, law enforcement revisited the case with forensic advances, including attempts to reanalyze digital metadata, traffic camera archives, and property records for overlooked connections. The lack of a definitive endpoint transformed the cul-de-sac into a symbolic landscape, a place of departure with no known arrival, where every quiet street and fenced yard became a potential clue or dead end. Kocher's name remained in police files, missing persons databases, and community memory, but the streets themselves offered no answers. The quiet of Henderson endured as if the pavement and the streetlights themselves were keeping secrets that no search or question could coax into daylight. The woman who vanished after Vegas, Jessie Foster. In the city that never sleeps, Jessie Foster moved through a world of neon lights and ceaseless traffic, her presence barely noted among the millions. The glow of Las Vegas spread outward into the dark Nevada plain like a restless heartbeat, pulsing with money, movement, and stories that began and ended in sudden turns of fortune. For some, this city offered reinvention. For others, disappearance. Jessie had come here seeking opportunity, her life drawn into the magnetism of its promise. Yet somewhere between the casinos, apartment complexes, and wide desert roads, she was quietly erased from view. Her days were filled with ordinary routines, shifts at her workplace, conversations with friends, and the small errands that marked life in a sprawling metropolis. Jessie was 21, bright, confident, and well-liked, a young woman from Canada who had come to the United States in 2005 after a visit turned into an extended stay. She lived for a time in North Las Vegas, keeping in touch with her family back home. To them, she spoke often of returning soon, her voice cheerful over the line. Few could have guessed that her name would one day appear on missing person lists across 2 countries. Her photograph circulated in search bulletins that would yield only silence. Her life in Nevada unfolded within an environment of contrasts. The glamour of the Strip was always within reach, yet her neighbourhood was quiet, anonymous, and far from the crowds that filled the resorts. She shared a home with acquaintances and sometimes stayed with friends. Her movements reflected the transient rhythm of a city where thousands came and went without notice. Police records later described her as sociable but independent, not someone easily led. Still, accounts were suggesting she'd fallen into less stable circles, places where trust could quickly dissolve. On the evening she vanished, Jessie's path traced familiar streets, though the city's expanse and countless byways offered endless unseen possibilities. It was March 28, 2006, when she was last heard from, a phone call to her mother, made as casually as any other. She spoke of plans to visit home for her sister's upcoming wedding. Days passed with no word, then weeks. By April, concern deepened into alarm. Her phone went silent, her bank account remained untouched, and her belongings were found undisturbed in the home she shared with her boyfriend, a man whose past would later draw scrutiny. Friends and family reported her missing when she failed to return home, and authorities quickly noted the absence of clues beyond her abandoned personal items. Her passport, clothes, and identification were left behind. There were no confirmed sightings, no witnesses who could place her beyond that spring day. The streets where she was last known to live did not indicate struggle or flight, only the ordinary quiet of suburban Las Vegas. Police interviews yielded conflicting statements, though none were strong enough to form a clear lead. Law enforcement canvassed the areas she frequented, reviewed digital records, and followed tips, yet the trail offered only fragments and unverified sightings. Detectives from North Las Vegas Police, along with cooperation from Canadian authorities, worked the case for years. Early on, theories centred on the possibility of human trafficking, a grim reality within certain corridors of the city. Reports linked other disappearances of young women to similar circumstances, yet none could be confirmed as connected. The investigation moved slowly, hampered by jurisdictional boundaries and the transient nature of the population. Her mother, Glendine Grant, became the enduring voice behind the search. From her home in Kamloops, British Columbia, she maintained public campaigns, interviews, and social media appeals to keep Jessie's name visible. Every few months, new reports surfaced, alleged sightings in various states, anonymous tips, even online messages claiming to hold answers, but each led to nothing. Time continued to stretch between that last call in March and the years that followed, marked by the persistence of a family unwilling to let her vanish entirely. In the years after her disappearance, the investigation uncovered troubling links between Jessie's acquaintances and suspected trafficking operations in the region. Law enforcement examined whether she had been coerced into sex work or targeted by organised groups preying on vulnerable young women. Evidence was circumstantial but consistent with patterns seen elsewhere in Nevada and neighbouring states. Advocacy organisations later cited her case as emblematic of how disappearances can occur unnoticed amid the noise of a major city. Among the few tangible traces left behind were police documents, noting that her phone records ceased abruptly within city limits, terminating near Craig Road, an ordinary corridor bordered by apartments and small businesses. Investigators reviewed hours of surveillance footage from nearby intersections, but no image of Jessie was ever confirmed. Even her vehicle, often a key anchor in missing person cases, provided no direction. It was found parked outside her residence as if she had intended to return, its interior undisturbed, keys missing but no signs of forced entry. To detectives, it appeared less like an escape and more like a pause, the quiet interruption of an unfinished day. The geography surrounding Las Vegas offered both concealment and distance. Beyond the city limits stretched miles of open desert terrain, where cars, debris, and even aircraft had vanished without a trace. For investigators, that landscape represented both possibility and futility. Searches were conducted in outlying areas, including sections of the Nevada desert, but the results yielded nothing. Every attempt to retrace her steps returned to the same uncertainty. No confirmed movement after that last phone call, no traceable departure from the area. Years later, the case remains open, each unanswered question emphasizing how even in populated areas, a person can disappear entirely without leaving a trace. The North Las Vegas Police Department still lists her as missing under unresolved circumstances, and her family continues to seek closure. Her story endures not because of its sensationalism, but because of its stark absence of resolution, a disappearance that resists every effort at explanation. Within Las Vegas, stories like Jessie's have become part of a quiet undercurrent. The city thrives on its reputation for spectacle, but beneath the surface runs a history of unsolved vanishings, each one swallowed by the same mix of anonymity and movement that defines the region. Investigators, criminologists and journalists alike have drawn attention to how transient economies, tourism, entertainment, construction, can mask darker realities. In that sense, Jessie's case is less an exception than a symptom, an echo within the hum of a restless city. Her mother continues to mark the passage of time not by years but by unanswered questions. Birthdays, anniversaries and holidays come and go, each one casting new shadows on an absence that has yet to lift. The photographs of Jessie that once filled family albums now circulate as reminders in public campaigns. Her image, smiling, confident, hopeful, remains frozen in that final year, untouched by the time that has since passed. The streets of Las Vegas continue their endless pulse, unaware of the absence woven into their rhythm, a presence erased from the very avenues she once walked. The vanished photographer at the mine shaft, rural Nye County case. In the far reaches of Nye County, where dust settles over forgotten claims and the land folds into miles of hollow valleys, an amateur photographer disappeared while chasing the remnants of Nevada's mining age. The man, a 32-year-old urban explorer named Daniel Rowe, was last seen on the outskirts of Tonopah, a town long accustomed to stories of things left behind. Once called the Queen of the Silver Camps, Tonopah's veins of quartz and silver once drew thousands across the high desert, but the booms faded and left behind an immense silence that still clings to the air. It was within that silence that Daniel parked his sedan near an abandoned shaft and never returned. Tonopah's outskirts are scattered with relics of the early 1900s boom, headframes still standing in rust, conveyor wheels broken and half buried in gravel, the remains of camps overrun by sagebrush. Daniel had been travelling through the state to document these remnants, his photograph showing a fascination with collapse and emptiness. His friends later told investigators that he planned to spend 2 nights exploring a line of defunct mines registered under the Tonopah Belmont claim, a site known for its unstable ground and open vertical shafts. The area is not officially monitored, though local authorities have posted warnings of collapsing tunnels and old dynamite caches dating back to the 1940s. That landscape, both alluring and dangerous, was the last place he was ever seen alive. The record of his final movements begins with a single fuel receipt. Surveillance footage from a gas station along US Route 6 shows him filling his car just after sunrise, camera bag over his shoulder, and a printed topographic map visible through the windshield. The timestamp reads 6:47 a.m. From there, his route could be traced by faint tyre marks heading northwest into Bureau of Land Management property, a patchwork of gravel tracks that wind toward the ghost site of Mizpah Extension Mine. By late afternoon, weather records show gusts reaching 30 miles an hour, enough to blur footprints within minutes and erase tyre impressions across the ridges. When Daniel failed to contact his sister that evening, as he routinely did during his travels, she filed a missing person report by the following day. The first search team reached the area within 36 hours. What they found was unsettlingly ordinary. His car sat parked beside a gravel pullout, driver's door locked, camera batteries charging through a dashboard adapter. Inside were 2 bottles of water, a field notebook, and a folded permit from the Nevada State Museum, indicating he'd recently photographed the Belmont Courthouse ruins. No signs of struggle or wildlife interference were visible around the car, though a set of footprints led toward a small ridge to the west. Searchers followed them for nearly half a mile before they vanished along a steep slope of talus and sage. That was where the first shaft appeared, a rusted cylinder of corrugated iron sinking into darkness, its wooden collar broken in 2 places. Beside it lay Daniel's camera. The discovery of the camera briefly raised hopes that he might have fallen and could be rescued. But when the Nevada Division of Mine Safety inspected the shaft with drones and infrared equipment, no human remains were found. The descent extended nearly 300 feet, the lower chamber flooded by decades of groundwater seepage. The camera, though dusty, was intact, its memory card holding 42 images. Investigators later released only a handful of them to the family. They showed typical scenes of his travels: head frames against a clouded horizon, rusted gears, and a self-timer shot of Daniel standing near an ore chute. The final image, time-stamped 4:03 p.m, depicted the open shaft itself, framed at a slight angle as though he had knelt to capture the depth. After that, nothing. The conditions around Tonopah make any disappearance particularly cruel. Daytime temperatures in early spring can swing from 90 degrees to near freezing by nightfall, and the terrain's fractured rock conceals countless narrow depressions invisible under loose soil. In similar incidents over the decades, hikers and rock collectors have vanished into sinkholes or air vents left from the mining era, their bodies never recovered. According to Nevada's Abandoned Minelands program, there are more than 200,000 such openings across the state, with less than a quarter secured or mapped. The remoteness of Nye County, larger than Vermont yet home to fewer than 50,000 people, ensures that many sites remain untouched, known only to those who seek them out. Search efforts for Daniel Rowe lasted 9 days. Volunteers from Tonopah joined sheriff's deputies and mine rescue personnel, combing the area with thermal drones and ground-penetrating radar. Dogs brought in from Clark County picked up faint scents that led across dry washes toward the foothills, but nothing substantial emerged. A single hiking boot was found caught between rocks near an old ventilation pipe, though investigators later determined it belonged to another explorer who had visited the site years earlier. Each day, the desert seemed to absorb evidence faster than it could be found. By the 10th morning, the official search was suspended, and the case was transferred to Nye County's cold case unit. In the months that followed, speculation surrounded his disappearance. Online forums for urban explorers debated whether he had intentionally staged his absence, citing his fascination with isolation and his posts about disappearing places. Others believed he may have encountered an unmarked shaft or even a military testing area beyond the permitted boundary. The Nevada Test and Training Range lies less than 100 miles southeast of Tonopah, and the region has long been shrouded in secrecy due to its Cold War history. Yet no evidence supported that he crossed into restricted territory. Cell tower data, analysed weeks later, showed his phone last connected near an access road south of the Mizpah extension, then went dark. No pings or data packets were received afterward, suggesting it either lost power or was destroyed. When his camera images were finally examined by forensic analysts, subtle inconsistencies emerged. Several shots contained faint blurs of light resembling lens flare, though one in particular drew attention, an indistinct shape in the far background of a ridge, pale against the darker slope. Some claimed it looked like a person standing near the mine entrance, others dismissed it as an optical artifact. His family asked for further analysis, but resolution limits made it impossible to determine. The object remained unidentified, an ambiguity that deepened rather than clarified the mystery. To this day, that final photograph is preserved in digital archives under the case record Nye County File 14-223. Years later, the site still attracts curiosity seekers. Some have reported hearing metallic echoes from the collapsed shafts, as if stone were shifting beneath the earth. Others describe finding fresh footprints near the ridge, although the area remains closed under state order. Locals in Tonopah say the desert around those mines holds a peculiar quiet, a soundlessness that amplifies each breath, each scrape of wind against the gravel. A historian from the Central Nevada Museum once remarked that the landscape seems designed to erase intrusion, reclaiming every trace of movement. For those who walk it, time feels uncertain, distances stretched, horizons repeating themselves until direction blurs. The official report remains unchanged. Daniel Rowe, last seen April 12, 2014, presumed missing in remote terrain near an abandoned mine site. There is no evidence of foul play, no recovered belongings beyond his camera, and no trace of human remains. The case stands as one among dozens in Nye County's record where disappearance merges seamlessly with geography. where isolation itself becomes both setting and cause. His photographs, later compiled by friends into a digital exhibit titled Echoes of the Empty West, capture a haunting symmetry between the man and the land he sought to document. Each frame dwells on abandonment, on the stillness of structures waiting to be forgotten. In the final image, the mine yawns open into shadow, its edge blurred by wind. No one has yet determined whether Daniel fell, wandered, or simply vanished into the desert silence. But somewhere in the dark below Tonopah, a camera once captured the last light he ever saw. The lone driver of Highway 50, Fallon Corridor Case. The highway that cuts across Nevada's centerline has no reason to end, yet it swallows those who follow it too far. Beyond Fallon, the landscape unravels into distances that seem to exist outside time, where salt flats shimmer against horizons of heat. Here, disappearances are not limited to the deep desert. They happen on the asphalt itself, among long-haul travelers who vanish between gas stations, their absence carried away by the wind. This is Highway 50, once called the loneliest road in America, a title meant as a warning but received instead as an invitation. He was last seen refueling in Fallon, the gateway town where the green of cultivated fields gives way to miles of wind-beaten plain. The driver, 40-year-old mechanic Matthew Holbrook, was crossing Nevada on his way to Ely to deliver a second-hand sedan purchased online. He left Reno early that morning, his route confirmed by digital toll records and a brief text to his employer noting clear skies and empty road. Fallon was his last verified stop. Witnesses described him as quiet, polite, and in no rush. He bought a cup of coffee, filled his tank, and turned east onto Highway 50. Just after 10 a.m. from there, no one saw him again. Out here, the road behaves like a mirage, a silver ribbon that seems to float, never arriving at the point it promises. Between Fallon and Austin, the corridor stretches through one of the state's most remote basins, bordered by the Clan Alpine and Stillwater Ranges. The pavement ripples from decades of sun, and the radio fades into static miles before the first sign warns travelers to fuel up. A single bar of reception comes and goes like a ghost. Yet for those who have driven it, there is a strange beauty to the emptiness. Forgotten rest stops, weathered billboards, and long sight lines that dissolve into the pale glare of salt. Matthew Holbrook drove into that expanse with no sign of distress, his car steady, his journey routine, until it wasn't. At 11:42 a.m., the driver's credit card logged a purchase at Middlegate Station, a roadside relic where travellers leave their names carved into the walls. Middlegate sits at a desolate crossroads, a scattering of trailers and an old bar left over from stagecoach days. The receipt confirmed he bought a soda and a pack of gum, and the attendant later told deputies that he lingered briefly, looking toward the horizon as though deciding which direction to take. Highway 50 continues straight through the basin, but a narrow turn-off, State Route 722, diverges toward the Shoshone Mountains, a scenic but rarely used alternative. No one could confirm which he chose. By the time his vehicle failed to arrive in Ely that night, his phone had already stopped transmitting signals somewhere east of Middlegate. Search teams began at that outpost, following the route east toward the desolate flats where the earth fractures into white salt and black volcanic stone. They found no skid marks, debris, or signs of an accident. Aerial patrols from the Nevada Highway Patrol scanned the corridor for days, mapping every visible object from Fallon to Austin. On the fourth day, a rancher reported seeing a glint of metal near the Dixie Valley turnoff, a region scarred by geothermal wells and testing grounds from the Cold War. When investigators arrived, they discovered nothing but a section of corrugated steel half buried in sand. Dust storms had passed through that week, capable of covering entire vehicles within hours, yet even beneath the dunes, no trace of his car was ever found. As speculation grew, investigators traced possible detours, narrow dirt spurs leading into the Dixie Valley Military Exclusion Zone. The valley once hosted nuclear simulations during the 1960s, and even today much of it remains restricted, patrolled by range personnel and monitored by unseen cameras. Some locals believe travelers occasionally stray onto those roads, mistaking them for shortcuts before encountering fences or warning signs. Others whisper of unmarked access trails, relics of early testing days that lead deep into terrain without exits. Officials, however, maintain that no civilian vehicle was recorded entering or approaching the range perimeter during that week. The GPS data from Holbrook's phone ended too abruptly for triangulation, as if its signal were abruptly severed rather than lost to distance. Fallon residents recall that spring as unseasonably cold. Winds scoured the basin for days, tearing at road signs and sending sand across the asphalt in long, ghost-like veils. Searchers later remarked that even footprints vanished between sweeps. The Nevada Department of Transportation records show no road closures along Highway 50 that day, but truckers passing through Middlegate reported near zero visibility east of Cold Springs. It is possible Holbrook slowed or pulled over during the storm, though no evidence supports that theory. His vehicle, a grey 2005 Honda Accord, would have been visible for miles under ordinary conditions, yet the desert has a way of swallowing what stands still too long. For those who know this road, stories of disappearance are almost as old as the pavement itself. During the stagecoach era, wagons were sometimes lost to flash floods that carved through hidden washes. In the 1930s, the Pony Express trail that preceded the modern highway was blamed for a string of vanishings attributed to exhaustion and heat stroke. Even after the route was paved, isolation persisted. A handful of unsolved cases mark its history. A teacher whose car was found near Sand Mountain in 1986. A long-distance runner who went missing during a relay in 2009. Each story follows the same pattern: a single traveller, a stretch of unbroken road, and a silence that endures long after the search has ended. Investigators eventually closed Holbrook's case as unresolved, citing a lack of evidence. His family declined interviews, though his sister later stated that he wasn't the kind of person who'd just walk away. Friends from Reno organised an annual drive along Highway 50 to raise awareness for missing persons, leaving markers at mile intervals between Fallon and Austin. The markers, small wooden signs bearing the initials MH, remain scattered along the shoulder, though wind and weather have taken most of them. The Nevada Missing Persons Clearinghouse lists his case among the few involving a vehicle that simply disappeared without a trace. It remains one of the least understood disappearances on the corridor in recent history. Each day, drivers glide through that corridor, unknowing that the land beneath them keeps its own quiet record. The asphalt hums beneath their tyres, the silence beyond their windshields stretching wider with every mile. From the windows of passing cars, the landscape seems empty but alive, salt gleaming like frost, sage trembling against invisible wind, the horizon rising and falling like a slow breath. Those who make the drive at night describe headlights fading into darkness so completely that it feels like the road has vanished beneath them. And in that stretch between Fallon and Austin, somewhere past the last cell tower and the first shadow of mountains, a man and his car remain unaccounted for. Between Fallon and Austin, the road grows silent, as if unwilling to remember who once crossed it. The camper who walked into the dust. Washoe County case. The campsite lay where wind and ridge meet under the pale Washoe sky. In northwestern Washoe County, Nevada, where the terrain shifts from tree-lined mountains to stretches of sage and basalt, a weekend camper vanished into quiet country that is seldom silent. Although most disappearances in Nevada are associated with deep desert places, this case shows that even fringe wilderness corridors, where forest gives way to an open basin, harbour mysteries. The location sat near the edge of the high plains, far enough from civilization for radio to fail and cell service to falter, yet close enough to a highway for someone to have arrived with ease and then simply walked away. She arrived mid-afternoon carrying a backpack, camera gear, and the kind of optimism that belongs to weekend wanderers. A 37-year-old botanist named Laura Spencer set up her tent in a clearing just south of the Virginia mountains' lower slopes. The site lay at roughly 5,500 feet elevation, amongst a plateau of tilting fault blocks typical of the Great Basin region. Temperatures hovered near 80 degrees when she began recording wildflowers common to the zone, sagebrush, rabbitbrush, and desert penstemon, in her field notebook. Witnesses in the nearby ranger station recalled her asking about the ridgeline to the west, noting that the view looked endless. She took a GPS waypoint at 3:22 p.m. for reference, then walked off toward the hills with her camera slung over her shoulder. By the time dust drifted over the hills, the dust had begun to gather in thin curtains across the ridgetops. The winds, as logged by the local weather station, reached sustained speeds of 25 miles per hour around 6 o'clock, stirring the coarse sand and lifting fine particles into hazy waves. The clearing, situated just where the basalt scree slopes begin under the higher ridges, echoed with the faint rustle of rock and sage. Laura paused at the edge of the tent's lantern light for a moment to photograph the pillared rocks of an ancient fault scarp, a rugged feature born of the basin and range stretching that defines this part of Nevada's geology. She noted in her notebook the way the shadows lengthened and set out toward a vantage point she had seen from the camp. Witnesses say she left the site at 5:17 p.m, capturing the hills with her lens before the last light faded. A neighbour camper reported seeing her heading westward along a faint 2-track trail that led upward into the ridge flank of the slope. The camera bag was observed slung loosely on one shoulder, her stride steady. The trail ended at a cairn someone had erected years earlier, used by hikers to mark direction in the sparse terrain. She took 1 or 2 photographs, then continued past the cairn as the wind picked up and the light softened. When she failed to return by 8 p.m, and her vehicle remained parked at the clearing long after midnight, the ranger station was alerted, and a search was initiated at first light. When rescue teams reached the clearing, they found only 2 boots planted side by side and the faint imprint of footprints vanishing into sagebrush. The tent remained collapsed as though she'd packed it, but the flap lay open. Her field notebook, gloves and water bottle sat untouched on the ground. The footprints led away from the clearing across a wash that contained basalt gravel and fine sand, and then disappeared as the ground flattened and the dust thickened. Search dogs followed the imprint for about 150 yards before returning to the handler without alert. The rangers deployed drones at dawn, but the dust storms of the previous night had blanketed the slopes and obscured detail. Although the area is semi-remote rather than deep desert, the rugged fault-block terrain makes brush clearing and line-of-sight search difficult. Without visible landmarks, the team eventually suspended ground search after 3 days, shifting to aerial surveys and satellite imagery. The ground here is folded and fractured, sagebrush hiding shallow washes and sudden drops that escape even the most careful gaze. Geologists classify this portion of Washoe County as part of the Basin and Range province, characterized by alternating stripes of uplifted mountains and downdropped valleys. The ridgelines rise abruptly from valley floors, and in spots, the loose debris of volcanic origin creates deceptive footing. At one juncture, the search team found a basalt slab wedged at a 45-degree angle beneath nearly a foot of dust, illustrating how swiftly the landscape can change. The wind carries fine grit into every fracture, and at dusk the horizon seems to dissolve into pale grey. Nearby springs are intermittent, vegetation is sparse, and the nights are cold. Those elements together create a place where someone can slip out of sight while solid ground begins to feel fluid. The ridges themselves bear the marks of centuries, fractured and twisted by fault lines that shift beneath each season's freeze and thaw. Loose talus and hidden washes carve deceptive paths along the slopes, while shallow gullies funnel dust and gravel into patterns that erase footprints within hours. Microclimates form in small hollows where cold air pools at night, leaving patches of frost even in spring, and sudden gusts of wind can lift sand into swirling curtains that obscure vision. Wildlife traverses these ridges silently. Coyote tracks, rabbit trails, and the occasional bobcat paw print cross the terrain, masking human traces and adding to the difficulty of following anyone who wanders too far. In this fractured landscape, a person stepping off the faint trail may quickly disappear from view, leaving only subtle, temporary signs that vanish almost as soon as they are made. Residents speak quietly of tracks lost in storms, and hikers followed by silence rather than rescue. In the late 1990s, a group of amateur rock collectors vanished on an unmarked spur and were found months later miles off their presumed route, some still clutching cameras. Though these cases differ in detail from Laura's, they reflect a pattern: temporary campsites in remote terrain, the sudden decision to wander, and the absence of any return. The Washoe County Sheriff's Office listed her case as a missing person file, number 170319, noting the last confirmed photo taken at the ridge at 5:22 p.m, and the next ping of her phone aborted near a ridgetop at 6:04 p.m. The phone signal log ceased entirely beyond that point, leaving investigators unable to determine whether she turned downhill, climbed further, or remained still. The terrain offers no obvious hiding places, yet it has swallowed wanderers before. Now the site returns to stillness, wind brushing across gear left behind and answering only to its own echoes. The collapsed tent remains propped among the sage. A bright orange camera strap lies coiled on flat ground. Rangers occasionally visit the clearing to replace a faded sign and record the condition of the site, but no new clues have emerged. The dust storms that swept the ridges shattered search patterns and likely displaced any faint tracks. The deeper washes show evidence of footfall, but nothing conclusive. Laura's backpack remains where it was found, zipped shut, as though she paused mid-motion and simply stepped away. The plateau holds its hush, and the wind marches over basalt and shrub alike, indifferent to presence or absence. The hills keep their secrets well, and the last footprints vanished before the wind could tell their story. The engineer who vanished at the test range, Lincoln County Industrial Site Case. The monitors flickered awake just before dawn, displaying power levels, radar feeds, and signal logs that would soon mark a man absent. In Lincoln County, Nevada, where the foothills stretch in quiet bands between desert valleys, a remote industrial site once tasked with communications, maintenance, and array testing waited for its daily operator. The towers stood like silent sentinels across the plateau, their red strobe lights dormant in the pre-sunlight hours. The facility had been constructed decades earlier, a relic of Cold War over-the-horizon radar experiments and subsequent communications upgrades, yet it remained active, manned only sporadically by contractors sent in to monitor, repair, and recalibrate equipment. He moved among the towers with practiced steps, clipboard in hand, checking each junction before the first light touched the foothills. 35-year-old systems engineer Daniel Hawthorne had arrived that morning under contract to inspect a recently upgraded relay array, part of a network linking radar installations across Nevada. His routine was methodical. Each amplifier, each backup generator, each cable junction was cross-referenced against schematics, and every reading was recorded in both notebook and secure digital log. Co-workers described him as meticulous and cautious, one who would never wander without purpose. Yet sometime in the evening, amidst the hum of electronics and faint whistle of wind across steel towers, Hawthorne disappeared. Within the steel hut, rows of amplifiers and backup generators hummed quietly, their displays recording every voltage fluctuation and frequency pulse. The interior smelled faintly of ozone and heated circuitry, a scent familiar to technicians who had spent decades navigating the isolated facility. Lights from LEDs reflected across polished metal, marking status levels for each module. Green for active, amber for maintenance required, red for malfunction. Temperature sensors and emergency cutoffs lined the walls, yet none could anticipate the human element vanishing from the equations. Surveillance cameras watched entrances and workbenches, but coverage was limited, leaving blind zones where shadows pooled. High-resolution cameras and motion sensors lined the perimeters, yet small blind spots existed where shadows pooled behind tower bases. Security gates required keycards, and every entrance and exit was logged with timestamps, but service pathways between towers were deliberately left open for contractor access. These narrow corridors and maintenance ramps created areas where a single person could move unseen, particularly during low light or gusty winds. The interplay of advanced monitoring and subtle blind zones highlighted the facility's paradox. Designed for precision and safety, yet still vulnerable to the unpredictable movements of a human operator. At 1947, the engineer radioed a routine confirmation, pausing mid-message as if the room itself had swallowed the words. Colleagues at the Regional Operations Center in Ely noted a brief static before the line went dead, an anomaly that did not register as critical at first. By 2015, when Hawthorne failed to report the completion of auxiliary power checks, an alert triggered a call to his vehicle. The van, a grey Ford E350 work truck, was still parked neatly near the loading dock. Inside, tools were arranged in order, safety gear hung on hooks, and his lunch tray remained untouched. No footprints led away from the facility that could be clearly attributed to him, and yet he was gone. Each signal, each reboot was logged automatically, creating a digital trail that paradoxically offered no clue when the engineer disappeared. Amplifiers recorded frequency stability, radar relays confirmed signal integrity, and auxiliary generators noted voltage fluctuations, all perfectly normal throughout the night. Maintenance schedules and procedural checklists were completed according to protocol, leaving investigators with no indication of malfunction or error. Even as analysts reviewed every automated entry, every sensor reading, the high-tech environment provided no hint of the human presence that had simply ceased to exist. The next morning, a field technician noted that a wrench remained on the workbench, a notebook open to schematics, and the van parked perfectly in its slot. Security logs indicated the access gates had not been used after his arrival, and no anomalies were detected in the electronic entry system. Helicopters and ground teams scoured the surrounding foothills, traversing rocky slopes and washes, but no trace of the engineer was found. Local rangers reported that the terrain, a mix of fractured granite outcrops and dry washes, made precise searching difficult. Dust from prior week's winds had settled into the scrub and crevices, obscuring even larger impressions. Faulty grounding lines, uneven platforms, and sudden gusts through the foothills make even routine inspections perilous in Lincoln County's remote industrial corridors. The site sits atop a lightly sloping plateau, flanked by shallow valleys that channel wind unpredictably. Surveys of the array noted that loose gravel on service ramps could shift under a footstep, and narrow pathways between towers left little room for recovery in case of misstep. Temperature swings of over 30 degrees between day and night create brittle metal and stiff cables, while echoing sounds of wind across steel structures can disorient even experienced personnel. For an engineer stepping outside the regulated paths, the landscape itself becomes a subtle adversary. Wind funnels through the foothills in sudden gusts, lifting dust, rattling antennas, and concealing even the most deliberate footprints. Loose gravel shifts along service ramps, while fractures in the granite outcrops create unseen drops between towers. Isolated washes and shallow gullies run across the plateau, easily overlooked but capable of diverting a person or hiding traces. Even trained technicians navigating familiar pathways can be caught off guard, and in combination with the remoteness of Lincoln County's landscape, the terrain transforms routine inspections into unpredictable challenges. For decades, the facility operated alongside Cold War experiments and over-the-horizon radar arrays, a place where errors could vanish without a trace. Historical records show several minor accidents in the 1970s and 1980s, most unreported beyond internal memos. Technicians lost briefly in canyon-like corridors, electrical surges causing equipment shutdowns, or vehicles that became stuck in washes. Lincoln County's sparse population and restricted zones mean that even small anomalies can go unnoticed for hours or days. While no previous disappearance mirrored Hawthorne's case entirely, the combination of isolation, industrial complexity, and unmarked terrain created an environment capable of absorbing human presence silently. Across the barren terrain, the towers pulse with light and sound, silent witnesses to a life that never returned. Access gates remain closed outside scheduled inspection hours. The hum of electricity pulses in the night while wind rattles the antenna masts. Engineers rotate in periodically to check readings and perform maintenance, but the station carries the ghost of a shift that ended without closure. Logbooks continue to note readings, schematics remain open on desks, and nothing hints at the absence that persists. Though technological surveillance is constant, the human trace that once interacted with the machinery has been erased. He dissolved into circuits and corridors, leaving nothing but the steady pulse of machines behind. The missing worker of Yucca Flat, Cold War-era case. Yucca Flat was fenced, patrolled, and alive with a quiet tension that spoke of atomic secrets and unseen dangers beyond the perimeter. The flat stretches of Lincoln County, Nevada, are often associated with open desert vanishings, yet this case demonstrates that isolation is not limited to sand and scrub. In the early 1960s, the Nevada test site expanded to accommodate a growing series of atmospheric and underground atomic tests, and workers moved daily across restricted corridors lined with instruments, communication lines, and guarded access points. Security was tight, and yet, in a place governed by procedure and surveillance, a man could simply disappear without a trace. He reported each day at the main gate, a clipboard in hand, one among dozens assigned to maintain operations under strict security. Thomas Keller, a 32-year-old technician contracted to oversee monitoring stations in the central sector of Yucca Flat, carried out daily inspections of generators, telemetry equipment, and Geiger counters. Known for his meticulous habits, Keller was respected among co-workers for both technical skill and attention to procedure. He had no history of risk-taking, yet one day, in late spring, his presence vanished from the records as suddenly as if he'd never existed within the rigidly controlled environment. Buildings of corrugated steel and concrete dotted the flat, holding instruments, generators, and communication lines that hummed with restricted data. Lines of fencing separated each sector, with guard towers and motion sensors reinforcing the perimeter. Inside the buildings, dials and switches measured radiation, voltage, and signal integrity, while outside the sun reflected off metal surfaces, creating visual illusions that could disorient an unsteady eye. Workers moved according to strict schedules, yet even the most regulated environment held blind spots where one could vanish without triggering alarms. The hum of instruments filled the air, a constant reminder of both activity and oversight. Yet in these corridors, control had its limits. High-resolution cameras and motion sensors lined the perimeter, yet small blind spots existed where shadows pooled behind tower bases. Security gates required keycards, and every entrance and exit was logged with timestamps, but service pathways between towers were deliberately left open for contractor access. These narrow corridors and maintenance ramps created areas where a single person could move unseen, particularly during low light or gusty winds. The interplay of advanced monitoring and subtle blind zones highlighted the facility's paradox, designed for precision and safety, yet still vulnerable to the unpredictable movements of a human operator. Each signal, each reboot was logged automatically, creating a digital trail that paradoxically offered no clue when the engineer disappeared. Amplifiers recorded frequency stability, radar relays confirmed signal integrity, and auxiliary generators noted voltage fluctuations, all perfectly normal throughout the day. Maintenance schedules and procedural checklists were completed according to protocol, leaving investigators with no indication of malfunction or error. Even as analysts reviewed every automated entry, every sensor reading, the high-tech environment provided no hint of the human presence that had simply ceased to exist. He radioed in at 14:33 to confirm the integrity of a monitoring station. That was the last trace of him officially recorded. His voice carried routine and calm, confirming readings and operational status, when a brief static interrupted the transmission. Colleagues later reported that the pause was fleeting and unremarkable at the time, yet retrospectively, it became the signal marking his absence. By the time supervisors attempted to contact him again, there was no response. Logs from communications arrays showed normal readings. The systems were functional, and yet the technician was gone. When search teams were authorized hours later, they found only a scattered set of tools, a half-open lunch pail, and a gate that had been properly secured. Ground teams combed the flat, checking telemetry stations, generator buildings, and service pathways, but found no further evidence. Cameras covering entrances and critical areas revealed nothing beyond the routine arrival and subsequent absence. Even the nearest geological features, small washes and shallow depressions in the otherwise level terrain, offered no clues. In a facility designed to monitor every movement, the disappearance remained inexplicable. The ground was scarred from decades of testing, unstable in places, littered with remnants of instrumentation and exposed cables that posed hazards for any wandering worker. Small depressions concealed loose gravel, and gusts of wind could whip dust into swirling sheets that erased footprints within minutes. Sections of fencing and service pathways created narrow corridors where missteps could go unnoticed, particularly in low light or when maintenance schedules were staggered. Even the most experienced technicians acknowledged that, despite strict procedures, human error or simply an unseen misstep could allow a person to disappear in plain sight. Sunlight glinted off the angular steel of towers and monitoring huts, casting stark shadows across the flat. The hum of generators and the intermittent crackle of distant radios lent a sense of life to the otherwise silent landscape. In moments between scheduled inspections, the flat seemed suspended in time, and yet the presence of Thomas Keller had been erased. The tools he carried, the logs he signed, and the pathways he traversed all remained as if he'd never completed his rounds, leaving only the mechanical pulse of instruments to mark activity. For decades, Yucca Flat had claimed minor disappearances and unexplained absences, all shrouded by classified reports and the silence of the Atomic Energy Commission. Internal memos hint at brief unaccounted-for intervals, employees missing from shifts without a clear explanation, yet documentation was rarely released publicly. The culture of secrecy meant that anomalies were quietly noted, and daily operations continued undisturbed. Historical accounts suggest that these minor disappearances, coupled with environmental hazards and the isolating effects of working in a high-security nuclear testing site, created conditions in which a worker could vanish without leaving tangible evidence. Investigators combed through old schematics, operational reports, and security logs, yet found only confirmation of standard procedures. Every sensor, every generator reading, every line of code reinforced that operations had continued flawlessly, leaving the human absence glaring in its anomaly. Interviews with colleagues added little, as the monotony of shifts, the repetition of inspections, and the strict separation of teams obscured precise knowledge of his movements. Even in an environment monitored with meticulous care, the question persisted: how could a man simply cease to exist in a place engineered to record every action? Now the site sits empty, with only the echo of footsteps never returned, and the hum of old generators whispering through fenced corridors. Buildings remain intact, equipment dormant or repurposed, and security checks continue along established schedules. Investigators and historians review the logs, schematics, and archived records, yet Thomas Keller's fate remains unresolved. The flat stretches silently, the sun reflecting off metal and concrete, indifferent to absence. Within the corridors designed to observe every movement, one presence was erased, leaving a space that no procedure could fill. The perimeter gates remain locked, yet somewhere inside a trace of him seems to linger, impossible to find and impossible to explain. The Wanderer of Alamo Road, Clark County Case. Alamo Road winds quietly through scrub and sagebrush, a corridor where few travellers pause and even fewer remain. Though not a desert in the strictest sense, this stretch of Clark County carries the same isolation that has swallowed others in Nevada. An expanse of dry washes, low hills, and unmarked paths where the land can erase a presence in hours. The road curves and dips, following the natural undulations of the terrain, and the sparse traffic moves with caution, aware that a single misstep, lost in wind, dust, or obscured trails, can render a person invisible to all who follow. He had no fixed address, only a worn backpack and a collection of notes that charted a life of quiet movement. Known to locals simply as the Wanderer, he drifted along the county roads, camping beneath trees at the edges of farmland, or in shallow washes where few would think to look. He was careful, polite and attentive to the rhythm of the land, often leaving small, half-written notes or markers indicating his next intended route. While most residents never encountered him directly, he had become something of a phantom figure in the local consciousness, familiar by reputation, but never fully understood. Each day he walked the edges of fields and washes, leaving markers and scraps of paper that locals sometimes noticed but rarely followed. His habits were meticulous: water rationed, notebooks protected in plastic, and belongings stacked neatly beside temporary camps. Observers recalled seeing him pause at the junctions of paths, sometimes taking photographs of the hills, the sky, or the wind-sculpted shapes of the sand. His movement was deliberate, almost ritualistic, as if the very act of travelling along these semi-wild corridors had its own significance. On the afternoon he vanished. The wind had picked up, carrying fine dust across the road and into every fold of the surrounding hills. It was the kind of gust that twists visual perception, flattens sound, and complicates navigation. He had left his camp early, stepping into the sunlight that reflected off the gravelly surface and the low-lying sage. A neighbour recalled seeing him at the edge of the field, walking toward a shallow wash that cut beneath a low rise, his figure disappearing intermittently behind the swells of dust. Beyond that point, nothing could confirm his passage. Neighbours later found his backpack propped against a fence post and half-written entries scattered on the ground, but no further trace of him. Small tokens, including a partially filled water bottle and a pair of worn boots, remained where he had last paused. Footprints led away from the site, then abruptly ended in loose soil that had been scoured by the wind. No tracks indicated a misstep or struggle, only the sudden absence of a person whose movements had been carefully chronicled until that day. Searchers combed the hills and washes, following patterns he was known to favour, but hours of tracking yielded only emptiness. The terrain can shift suddenly. Shallow gullies, loose soil and hidden arroyos conspire with the wind to obscure even the most deliberate tracks. Dust devils spin along the roadside, briefly revealing impressions of footprints before erasing them. The hills along Alamo Road rise and fall in subtle waves, hiding pockets of shade where a person might take refuge or vanish unnoticed. Even seasoned locals and occasional searchers admit that the combination of these features, together with the unpredictability of weather, can erase a person's trail as quickly as they are made. Coyotes and jackrabbits moved silently through the sagebrush, their occasional tracks intersecting those of the wanderer, but offering no guidance to his path. The soft patter of paws and the rustle of dry grass were the only living indicators of presence in the otherwise quiet corridor. Observers noted that these animals often avoided human proximity, yet in the shifting patterns of wind and dust, even their signs could mislead or disappear, leaving searchers with a landscape that seemed alternately familiar and alien. The interplay between wildlife and wandering human traces underscored how quickly evidence could vanish in Clark County's semi-arid terrain. Clark County has long been a corridor for wanderers and drifters, a place where routine travel can dissolve into weeks of uncertainty and small, unexplained disappearances. Ranchers, highway maintenance crews and long-term residents recall stories of individuals who came and went with little record, leaving only faint traces of their passage. In many cases, the land itself seemed indifferent to human presence. Footprints, notes, or discarded items could vanish overnight, swallowed by wind or dust. This backdrop of impermanence framed the wanderer's disappearance not as an anomaly of neglect, but as part of a long, shadowed history in the county. Long before modern vehicles, these corridors had guided settlers, ranchers, and drifters alike, their footsteps echoing in local memory. Alamo Road traces a faint lineage of travel, linking isolated homesteads, seasonal grazing lands, and ephemeral campsites. Oral histories recalled transient figures who appeared briefly, leaving only hints of their presence behind. In this way, the wanderer became part of a continuum, his disappearance resonating with a history of movement and uncertainty that the land itself seemed to absorb. These layers of memory, combined with environmental impermanence, made locating any single individual a challenge both practical and intangible. Occasional searches turned up fragments of his routine. An empty tin beneath a juniper tree, a hastily scribbled note tucked into the crook of a fence post, the impression of a backpack left standing upright on a hill. Each discovery suggested he had paused, perhaps to rest or document the landscape, yet offered no guidance to his next steps. The wind-sharpened sun and shifting soil meant that even these small markers were fleeting, disappearing into the same patterns that claimed his footprints. Those who retraced his intended path described an unsettling quiet, punctuated only by the scrape of loose gravel or the distant caw of a raven. Time passed, and Alamo Road returned to its habitual silence, yet the absence of the wanderer persisted. Locals still remember the ephemeral markers he left behind, sometimes pointing them out with a mix of curiosity and unease. The corridor remains largely unchanged, the low hills and sagebrush standing as they did decades before, and yet the road now carries a lingering question. Where had he gone, and why did the land, the wind, and the soil conspire to erase him so completely? Once more, the route lies empty, traced only by delicate footprints and the fading echo of someone who never came back. The sun arcs across the hills, casting long shadows over the washes, while dust drifts silently across gravel and sage. Alamo Road holds no evidence of struggle or foul play, only the traces of someone who once moved deliberately through its curves and dips, now swallowed entirely by the environment. In the shadow of Alamo Road's curve, he vanished into the terrain, leaving whispers of movement as the sole trace. The night shift that never ended, Pahrump Worksite Case. The hum of the generator filled the cab as he traced the familiar circuit, noting every shadow and flicker of motion. Night had settled across the worksite, transforming steel frameworks and scattered equipment into silhouettes that flickered and stretched under the harsh glare of floodlights. Pahrump lay quiet beyond the boundaries, its small town lights distant and unobtrusive, while the isolated industrial site pulsed with its own rhythm. Machines idling, alarms ready. But human presence reduced to one watchful figure in a patrol vehicle. The regularity of his rounds had become a ritual, a pattern so ingrained that deviation was unthinkable. He prided himself on knowing the site better than anyone, aware of each gate, each storage container, and every path that led to the perimeter. As a night security guard, he had memorized every checkpoint and familiarized himself with the subtle quirks of the terrain. Loose gravel patches, blind spots behind stacked containers, and faintly marked service paths that led to generators and temporary structures. Experience had taught him to anticipate anomalies, doors left ajar, misplaced tools, or unusual noises. But the night offered a deceptive calm, and even the most practiced observer could overlook subtle irregularities. Headlights cut through the darkness as the patrol vehicle rolled over gravel, illuminating the edges of steel frameworks and scattered equipment. Shadows twisted unnaturally across storage units, and the skeletal outlines of unfinished structures, making the familiar sight feel alien under artificial light. The wind, although mild, stirred dust along the perimeter, creating fleeting curtains of haze that masked the edges of the terrain. Occasionally, the faint clatter of metal against metal, loose piping, or a tool shifted by the breeze broke the monotony, reminding him that vigilance was essential even when nothing seemed amiss. Over the radio at 2:17 came a routine Northern Fence report, the final voice heard before the frequency was claimed by silence. His report confirmed the integrity of the gate, the security of storage areas, and the operation of the floodlights along the perimeter. Beyond the brief transmission, the site seemed to exhale a hushed stillness, punctuated only by the soft hum of generators and the occasional rustle of wind across debris. Moments later, colleagues attempting to reach him over the radio received no response. The frequency remained open, carrying nothing but the subtle, uninterrupted hum of machinery. When search teams arrived, the vehicle was still running, its headlights shining over empty grounds, keys in the ignition, and the dashboard untouched. No sign indicated the guard had exited in haste, and no tracks led away from the vehicle through the gravel or soft patches of dirt. Tools that he typically carried for minor inspections were neatly stowed. Radios, notebooks, and flashlights remained in place. The meticulous order contrasted sharply with his absence, as though a single deliberate erasure had removed him from the landscape entirely. Shadows stretched across the machinery and dirt, blending with the cool desert air and the faint, distant cry of nocturnal wildlife. Desert nights can sharpen perception, but they can also distort it. Shadows mimic movement, wind sculpts patterns across gravel, and sound carries oddly over open expanses. Observers noted that even minor deviations in terrain, an incline, a shallow wash, a pile of construction materials, can confuse searchers, erasing or redirecting tracks. Within this combination of artificial light and natural unpredictability, it became clear how a person could vanish in a space otherwise dominated by control and routine. Co-workers described him as meticulous, never missing a check, yet his disappearance joined a history of unexplained occurrences at the site. Temporary structures, equipment, and patrol patterns had occasionally produced minor anomalies. Alarms that triggered without cause, items found in unusual positions, fleeting shadows on surveillance footage that were never explained. None had resulted in a disappearance until that night. Investigators combed logs, video recordings, and site schematics, confirming every procedure had been followed, yet the human presence that had sustained them was gone. Cameras perched atop the tallest scaffolding recorded the night in grainy monochrome, yet revealed nothing of the guard's final moments. Footage showed empty pathways, machinery humming, and shadows bending in ways the eye could barely follow, but no trace of him appeared on screen. Investigators reviewed every angle, cross-referencing patrol logs and video timestamps, only to confirm the impossible. He had vanished within a space that had been under constant observation. The discrepancy between recorded activity and his absence added an unnerving, almost cinematic quality to the unfolding mystery. Occasional environmental factors compounded the mystery. Desert winds intensified unexpectedly, carrying loose gravel and sand across the site. Temperature drops chilled the exposed night air, and distant wildlife added subtle, indistinguishable noises. Generators and machinery continued to operate, their vibrations transmitted through the soil, while floodlights cast long, sharp shadows that constantly shifted. Within these conditions, even a cautious, experienced individual could encounter disorientation or unforeseen hazards, but the meticulous order left behind suggested that no accident had occurred in the usual sense. Investigators expanded their search beyond the site, examining surrounding hills, washes and service roads, yet found no evidence of the guard's passage. Footprints leading from the patrol route were absent, and no disturbances indicated movement into nearby terrain. Reports confirmed that vehicles and personnel had moved according to protocol, leaving only an unbroken trail of controlled activity. The worksite, once a symbol of human order and surveillance, had become a setting for a disappearance that eluded all rational explanation. Even weeks later, the site retained an eerie stillness, machines continuing to hum, floodlights casting a perpetual glow over empty grounds. Co-workers who resumed night shift spoke of heightened awareness and unease, as though the absence of a single person had altered the rhythm of operations. Though every precaution was taken, no pattern, mechanical or procedural, could account for the disappearance. Each patrol now carried the weight of unanswered questions, a reminder that even the most controlled environment could not guarantee observation of all that occurred within it. Night crews soon reported a heightened awareness, a quiet unease that shadowed each patrol and checkpoint in the ensuing weeks. Each shadow seemed longer, each gust of wind more deliberate, and even routine machinery noises provoked unease. Supervisors implemented extra check-ins, doubled lighting in critical zones, and altered patrol schedules, but no protocol could restore the sense of certainty lost the night the guard vanished. The worksite continued to operate, yet it had become a place where control and normalcy coexisted uneasily with the lingering echo of absence. The night persisted, generators humming alone, as if waiting for a presence that would never return. Steel frameworks and half-built structures remained, silently reflecting light into shadowed corners, while distant hills absorbed every sound. No trace of the guard emerged, despite exhaustive searches, logs and witness accounts. His absence created a void more tangible than any physical mark, a silent testimony to the vulnerability of human presence amid machinery and night. The worksite remained illuminated, every machine in motion, yet one man had vanished into the night without a trace. The truck that waited in silence, Esmeralda County case. The pickup sat alone on the cracked surface of a dry lake bed, engine still running, as though waiting for a driver who would never return. The flat expanse reflected the fading sunlight, streaked with white salt deposits that had formed over decades of intermittent flooding. Small fissures crisscrossed the surface, their jagged edges catching the last rays of day and casting miniature shadows that danced with every gust of wind. The basins stretched towards low hills on the horizon, where jagged rock faces met sky, and the emptiness swallowed any sense of scale. Tire tracks from distant travellers marked the earth, yet none approached the pickup, leaving it isolated amid the shifting textures of soil and salt. Inside, the cab retained the faint scent of gasoline and dust, papers resting atop the console as if he'd stepped out for a moment. A notebook lay open, its pages fluttering in the breeze seeping through a cracked window, while a half-full water bottle balanced precariously in a cup holder. Small smudges of dust hinted at the driver's presence, yet they offered no clues as to why he had departed. The ignition remained engaged, the gearshift in neutral and the radio silent. There were no indications of panic or struggle. The environment inside the cab suggested a simple exit, a brief step away that should have returned to routine, but it did not. Around the truck, the ground stretched flat and unbroken, save for tyre impressions fading into the fine windblown soil. Pebbles and salt crystals shifted with each passing breeze, erasing the outline of tracks almost as soon as they were formed. Occasional animal prints, coyote and raven, intersected faintly with the perimeter, but they left nothing resembling human passage. The dry lakebed surface, deceptively firm, could conceal hollows, hidden patches of soft clay, or brittle crusts that gave way under weight. Investigators noted that even careful steps could vanish without a trace, and in this environment, the smallest lapse in observation could obscure the most vital evidence. Even in the relative calm of late afternoon, the air shimmered with heat, creating illusions that distorted the distant horizon. Occasional gusts lifted fine salt and dust into small eddies that shifted across the lake bed, erasing faint impressions almost as soon as they formed. Searchers noted that footprints could vanish within minutes, swallowed by the ever-changing surface, and that even the slightest movement in the wind made it impossible to determine the original path of travel. The interplay between sun, wind, and reflective ground rendered distances deceptive and altered perception, leaving investigators to confront the possibility that the land itself conspired to conceal the driver's movements. Investigators traced faint footprints that led away from the vehicle, only to dissolve abruptly where the earth gave way to loose gravel or shallow depressions. The impression suggested a single individual had exited the pickup and moved toward the basin, yet each step faded into nothing. Searchers measured distances between faint marks, estimated stride length, and calculated likely paths, yet the land itself appeared to absorb the traveller. Even with aerial drones and satellite imagery, the open expanse betrayed no further signs of movement. Each investigation reinforced the impossibility of reconstructing what had happened, emphasizing the capriciousness of the terrain. Based on the direction of tracks and terrain contours, the driver may have sought cover, followed an animal path, or moved toward the distant hills, yet the land did not explain his sudden absence. Shallow washes and undulating clay beds could conceal movement, yet none provided shelter or a plausible endpoint. The uniformity of the salt-encrusted lake bed, combined with patches of loose sand, created visual illusions, leading searchers to misjudge distances or misinterpret depressions as tracks. Mirages or the heat shimmer rising from distant rock faces might have distorted perception, complicating even the most methodical reconstruction of events. Law enforcement combed the surrounding desert-adjacent expanse, contending with vast stretches of barren washes and subtle depressions that swallowed signs of passage. K9 units scoured the ground, tracing scents that evaporated in dry air. Drones scanned overhead, capturing video of unbroken terrain, and officers on ATVs combed likely routes. Yet all search efforts converged on the same outcome: no trace of the driver beyond the initial footprints. Even seasoned personnel noted the impossibility of tracking someone in this region without immediate physical cues. The land, indifferent and expansive, continued its quiet erasure of human presence. Esmeralda County has long been a place where vehicles appear abandoned and travelers vanish, a region defined by isolation, low population density and unmonitored corridors that have claimed the unwary. Ranchers recall trucks discovered in dry washes, engines running, but no occupant nearby. Mining routes from the early 20th century cross the county, leaving remnant paths that still appear on satellite imagery, and occasional travelers follow these tracks only to encounter the same emptiness. Records show that disappearances and abandoned vehicles have occurred over decades, often without explanation, underscoring the challenges of human survival and observation in such stark, unforgiving terrain. Local ranchers and travelers who had traversed the basin for decades spoke of the uncanny stillness that often preceded disappearances. They described an absence of wind when it should have blown, sudden silences from wildlife, and a disorienting sense of vast openness that seemed to swallow sound and motion. Accounts of abandoned vehicles or temporary campsites mirrored the pickup's current state, with belongings meticulously left behind as if the occupants had intended a short return. These recollections lent the case a sense of continuity within the county's history, suggesting that the terrain's enigmatic qualities had claimed lives and confounded observers long before modern investigative tools arrived. Environmental factors compounded the mystery. Winds swept constantly across the flat expanse, carrying fine dust and salt, erasing both footprints and tire marks. Temperature swings were extreme, falling rapidly after sundown, chilling the surface and any exposed items. The terrain was unforgiving. Brittle salt crust could crack underfoot, loose gravel could swallow shoes, and shallow depressions created visual traps that misled even experienced observers. Small desert wildlife, rabbits, coyotes, and ravens, occasionally disturbed the sparse evidence, further confusing searchers. In this unforgiving environment, the driver's absence seemed amplified, a stark testament to the desert-adjacent land's capacity to erase human traces. Even weeks later, the pickup remained in place, slowly accumulating dust, the windshield etched with fine salt particles, tires beginning to flatten slightly from long immobility. Travelers and locals occasionally approached the vehicle, noting the incongruity of its presence and the meticulous order inside the cab. Papers, water bottle, and jacket remained undisturbed, evidence of a life interrupted rather than abandoned. The truck, isolated yet intact, became a silent sentinel over an unresolved disappearance, a focal point for speculation, fear and curiosity. The emptiness of the surrounding basin emphasized the absurdity of a vanishing in such exposed conditions. Now, the truck sits as both witness and mystery, its engine cold but still ready, headlights long dimmed with the passing of time. Investigators have documented the site extensively, mapping tyre tracks, photographing footprints, and creating detailed diagrams, yet nothing has offered an explanation. Every approach, every attempted reconstruction, has failed to clarify how a single individual could exit a vehicle in plain sight and simply vanish. The surrounding landscape continues its patient, indifferent erasure, folding footprints, smoothing salt crust, and reclaiming the signs of presence that had once seemed permanent. Somewhere beyond the fading tracks and shifting dust, the driver had disappeared, leaving the truck and the indifferent land as the sole witnesses to a disappearance that defied explanation. The woman whose phone died over empty range. Cell ping case, Northern Nevada. Her last cell ping traced a straight line across a vast, uninhabited basin, ending where no road or trail could be found. The signal came in the early evening, when the sun had already begun to cast long shadows over low hills and dry washes. Satellite maps showed the surrounding area as a patchwork of flat basins, scattered sagebrush, and rocky outcroppings, with only faint dirt tracks intersecting the land. For a few moments, the digital trace suggested movement, a continuation of ordinary travel, before it ceased entirely, leaving investigators with a point on the grid and a profound absence where a person should have been. She had been travelling north from a small town carrying nothing more than a backpack, her itinerary ordinary yet precise. Friends and family noted her careful planning. She intended a brief solo journey through sparsely populated areas, familiar with the risks but not expecting them to become a mystery. Her route had been mapped, stops noted, and check-ins scheduled. Each detail reinforced the stark contrast between preparation and disappearance. What was meant to be a routine excursion became an enigma, the modern conveniences of navigation and communication abruptly halted by a landscape that neither respected nor revealed the human presence within it. Northern Nevada's hills and dry basins stretched endlessly, dotted with scrub and occasional rocky outcrops that offered little cover but complicated every search. Winds swept across shallow depressions and salt-crusted flats, erasing subtle traces of passage almost immediately. The sparse vegetation created a camouflage of its own. Small shrubs and sagebrush could obscure footprints or tyre marks, while undulating terrain made the distances deceptive. In this open expanse, heat shimmer blurred the horizon during the day, and cold settled quickly after sunset, leaving searchers to contend with the extremes of temperature and the disorienting qualities of a vast empty land. The digital breadcrumbs were analysed by investigators, who triangulated signals between distant towers, observing increasingly sporadic and isolated pings tracing her path. Mobile network logs indicated her device had moved farther from established coverage areas, dropping in strength and frequency. Each successful ping created a point in space and time, yet between those points, the land remained opaque, unmonitored and indifferent. Specialists could estimate approximate speed and direction, but the signal's final disappearance left a void that no triangulation or algorithm could penetrate, highlighting the limits of technology and confronting the sheer emptiness of remote terrain. Cell towers in this remote region are spaced miles apart, leaving vast gaps where a signal could weaken or vanish entirely. Investigators noted that the terrain, interspersed with shallow valleys and low ridges, can block or distort transmissions, creating areas where a device might appear inactive even while physically moving. The irregular distribution of coverage, combined with intermittent connectivity, meant that her last pings could have coincided with such a dead zone, obscuring her precise movements and complicating the reconstruction of her journey. The ground yielded nothing, no footprints, no tyre marks, leaving only the phone's digital trail as proof of her passage. Small depressions in the soil could have been misinterpreted as evidence, yet the investigators noted they were natural formations shaped by wind and erosion. Tracks that might have indicated travel on foot or by vehicle were absent, leaving a paradox. The digital record proved she had moved into the area, but the physical world offered no confirmation. Even the presence of wildlife, coyotes, ravens, and occasional rodents, yielded nothing that could guide search efforts or hint at her movements. Drones, helicopters, and off-road vehicles swept the empty range, but the land offered no hint that a human had passed through. Thermal imaging failed to detect heat signatures, and infrared sweeps showed only natural features. Satellite imagery provided no additional insight beyond the cell ping coordinates. Ground teams walked measured grids, marking the terrain with GPS trackers and leaving behind small markers to map coverage, yet each sweep ended in emptiness. The vast, open landscape of northern Nevada resisted every attempt to impose pattern or clarity upon it, maintaining the mystery in both digital and physical forms. The land itself posed subtle threats, from hidden washouts to deceptively soft patches of soil that could halt or redirect passage. Even a brief detour around a small rocky outcrop could lead a traveller into areas where movement left no trace, as the soil's shifting crust absorbed footprints. Small ravines and dry stream beds created natural barriers, forcing route changes that were invisible from aerial or satellite observation. Search teams speculated that such features may have contributed to the disappearance, turning ordinary steps into irreversible vanishing points across the empty range. The region had long claimed travellers and wanderers, a place where the combination of isolation, sparse population, and challenging terrain left disappearances all but invisible. Historical records note vehicles abandoned along unpaved corridors, hikers lost amid hills and washes, and temporary campsites left untouched. Even seasoned locals spoke of the area with a cautious reverence, noting the way wind, heat, and topography could erase a person's presence in hours. Her disappearance fit a larger pattern. The same land that had allowed humans to navigate its expanse for centuries also ensured that those who vanished were rarely recovered. The final ping lingered alone in the digital grid, the sole evidence of someone who had simply vanished. Investigators could replay the coordinates, watch the trail arc across the empty basins, and yet no insight emerged beyond the sudden halt. The device had no distress signal, no indication of accident or interference. It had simply ceased. The surrounding landscape, once triangulated through technology, retained its stillness, indifferent to the human narrative imposed upon it. Each echo of signal and pixel on a screen could not convey the isolation of the terrain, the harshness of the ground, or the unsettling finality of a trace that abruptly ended. Even in the hours following her disappearance, the open basins offered no hint of her presence. Dust, sparse scrub, and uneven soil patterns obscured any possible tracks. Wind shifted constantly, lifting fine particulates and flattening depressions, and small washes diverted attention without revealing movement. Searchers noted that a single misstep, a slightly altered route, or even natural erosion could remove evidence entirely. The interplay of environmental forces and the limitations of technology made the vanishing seem not only possible but inevitable within this context. The phone's inactivity highlighted the paradox of modern travel. In a connected world, even digital traces can be erased by the indifferent land. Cell towers, satellites, and digital logs painted a partial narrative, one that suggested location, movement, and intent, but failed to capture the final moments or context. The human element, the decisions, the terrain interactions, and the unknown variables remained unrecorded. Technology could point to where she was last known, but it could not illuminate what had occurred once she entered that empty range. In the midst of that empty corridor, all physical signs of her vanished, leaving only a faint electronic whisper in a land that refused acknowledgement. The passenger who never made the return trip. Interstate 15 corridor case. The journey along Interstate 15 began like any other, a routine passage through northern Nevada's vast open stretches. Vehicles moved in regular intervals, punctuating the monotony of asphalt with fleeting motion. Roadside signs marked distances to small towns and rest areas, and the occasional overpass created brief intersections of sound and shadow. Yet in the midst of this ordinary flow, a single passenger would vanish, a disappearance that contrasted sharply with the rhythm of the highway and the assumed safety of well-travelled lanes. The passenger had travelled frequently, familiar with long drives and the rhythm of the highway, yet this trip would end differently. Known to friends as cautious and methodical, she'd planned the journey carefully, taking note of fuel stops, rest points, and expected arrival times. The route from Las Vegas to a northern destination was familiar, regularly traversed by commuters and long-haul travelers alike. Her vehicle carried only essential belongings, packed for a short journey, with nothing that suggested haste or distress. Every preparation reinforced the incongruity of the outcome, a carefully mapped journey that would abruptly dissolve into uncertainty. Though a major corridor, portions of the interstate cut through isolated expanses where few vehicles traversed the road for miles at a time. Rolling hills and open basins flanked the lanes, punctuated only by distant mountains and occasional roadside washes. Long stretches were devoid of lighting, and roadside vegetation remained sparse, offering no concealment but adding a sense of dislocation for those passing through. These segments, while integral to the state's transport network, created intervals where a traveller could be effectively invisible, the movement of a single car lost among the empty miles and endless horizon. The last confirmed sighting occurred at a rest stop, where a brief pause left luggage and a faint impression of human presence behind. Surveillance footage captured her entering the facility to retrieve food and use the facilities, but the subsequent exit went unrecorded. Personal items remained in the vehicle, hinting at an expectation of the immediate return. Witness accounts were limited to fleeting glimpses, the transient nature of the location amplifying the suddenness of the absence. When the vehicle departed the rest area, the passenger was nowhere to be seen. Scattered along the roadside, the recovered personal items suggested sudden movement or an unexpected detachment from the vehicle. A small backpack lay near a drainage ditch, partially covered by windblown debris, while a water bottle and a pair of gloves appeared several dozen feet away. Each item offered clues yet raised more questions. The spacing suggested deliberate movement, yet no footprints, drag marks, or tire impressions could corroborate a path of travel. The terrain itself seemed to absorb evidence, leaving only the barest indication that someone had been there. With sweeping vistas and steep embankments around them, search teams methodically combed shoulders, ditches and nearby washes, careful of passing vehicles. Highway patrol units deployed on foot and in vehicles, marking grids along stretches that spanned several miles. Helicopter teams conducted aerial sweeps, while ground crews attempted to follow any subtle depressions in soil or vegetation. Despite exhaustive efforts, no additional human trace emerged. Even natural factors, the shifting wind, occasional rain, and seasonal frost, worked against investigators, rapidly erasing signs of movement and compounding the challenge of pinpointing where the disappearance had occurred. Northern Nevada highways have a quiet history of unexplained vanishings, from solo travelers to occasional passengers who never reach their intended destinations. Interstate corridors, despite their infrastructure and oversight, intersect with vast, sparsely populated regions where the land's isolation can quickly overwhelm the presence of a single individual. Historical accounts document vehicles found with occupants missing, abandoned along shoulders or partially concealed in washes. The passenger's disappearance became another entry in a pattern that both law enforcement and local communities recognized, yet could neither explain nor prevent. The juxtaposition of human routine and natural indifference remained stark. The highway, designed for connection, efficiency, and observation, intersected with an environment capable of swallowing movement entirely. Surveillance cameras captured routine traffic, rest stops marked fleeting interactions, and roadside signage pointed travelers along predictable paths, but the passenger's journey ended in a void where infrastructure and oversight failed. Even as investigators traced her route and retraced the steps she might have taken, the land and asphalt held their secrets tightly, leaving only fragments for analysis and speculation. Hours of review of toll records, traffic logs, and regional mapping offered no further insight. Authorities examined the spacing between vehicles, noting the gaps in traffic that coincided with the likely window of disappearance. Cellular data was sparse, providing only approximate estimates of location, and no distress signals were recorded. Search dogs, guided by the faintest scent, could not identify a trail through the washes and embankments, hindered by wind, terrain, and the passage of time. Each method illuminated a part of the puzzle but ultimately reinforced the mystery, highlighting how quickly a presence could vanish even in the heart of a major interstate corridor. Even as days passed, the interstate continued to carry travelers, oblivious to the absence that had occurred along its path. Emergency call boxes, rest stops, and the distant hum of tires offered reassurance to those moving along the corridor, yet the reality remained that a person had disappeared within this web of infrastructure. Investigators could reconstruct movement in theory, triangulate approximate locations, and speculate about points of departure, but the human reality, the moment when a presence ceased, remained unrecorded and unknowable. The final consideration was both technological and human. Even in a connected, monitored environment, there existed spaces of vulnerability where routine could intersect with danger, and familiarity offered no guarantee of safety. Interstate 15 stretched for miles beyond the last known point, blending road, landscape and horizon into an indistinguishable continuum. The disappearance underscored the precariousness of solitary travel, the limits of observation, and how even ordinary journeys can intersect with extraordinary mystery. A single journey ended somewhere along that boundless corridor, leaving no mark that the asphalt or surrounding land would acknowledge.